Great, thank you. I want to welcome everybody to the April 7th, 2022 online meeting of the Seattle Design Commission. Our meetings are designed to meet the governor's executive orders allowing online meetings during the COVID pandemic. Our meetings are being recorded through WebEx to be posted later on our website. Our meeting this morning from 9 until 12:30 will be evaluating options disclosed in Sound Transit's draft EIS for the West Seattle crossing and the segment to Delridge. Our discussion today will be led by Elaine Wine. We'll break at 12:30 for lunch and then have a short business section from 1 until 2. In terms of the meeting format, the team will be providing a briefing on the proposal broken into 3 segments: a larger project overview, including city policy background, followed by the Duwamish crossing options, and then options for a Delridge station. There is an opportunity for public comment, which I'll talk about in a minute. For each of these segments, each commissioner will ask clarifying questions immediately followed by comments. I sent the chair the order for commissioner questions and deliberation, as well as all the commissioners on the call today. Again, the discussion will be led by Elaine, and I'll also post a question order in the chat. WebEx does allow for the public to participate in real time. We'll have an opportunity for public comment after the presentations. If you are wanting to make public comment today, please sign up on the sign-in sheet attached to the meeting agenda. And when it's time for that, if you want to just raise the hand, and the hand raising function of WebEx will recognize you. And if anyone didn't get an opportunity or have follow-up comment, you can contact us through the Seattle Design Commission email on our website. Why don't we start with introductions of commissioners in alphabetic order by your first name, and if you can also indicate your position on the commission. We'll follow that with Seattle Design Commission staff, city staff, and the project team. And then finally, if you can make sure to mute when you're not speaking, that'd be great. I think you're going to start us out, Amalia, is that correct?
I always forget when Adam's not here. Amalia Layton Cody, Transportation Planner position, Commissioner.
Good morning, Elaine Wine, Architect Commissioner.
Good morning, Elizabeth Connor, Artist Commissioner.
Good morning, Erica Bush, Urban Design Commissioner.
Hi, I'm Jill Crary, the At-Large Commissioner.
Hi, Matt Alfs, Architect Commissioner.
I'm Pooja Shah, Engineer Commissioner.
And good morning, Vanita Sidhu, Landscape Architect Commissioner and Chair.
Good morning, Michael Jenkins, the Seattle Design Commission.
Valerie Keenest, staff.
Juliet Acevedo, staff.
And then Vera, your team.
Sure, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Vera Giampietro. I'm a planner in the Office of Planning and Community Development with the City of Seattle, and I'm leading the planning work group for the city on the West Seattle Ballard Link Extensions project. We've got a few folks from the city who will be presenting on background today on city initiatives and efforts that are related to the West Seattle Ballard project. So I'll start with, let's see, Betsy Lyons. If you would introduce yourself, Betsy.
Hi, I'm Betsy Lyons. I'm with Seattle Public Utilities, and I manage our creek culvert program, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the implications for the creeks of the crossings.
Great, thank you, Betsy. Next, we have David Graves.
Morning all. David Graves, Seattle Parks and Recreation. I'm our kind of liaison with the Sound Transit project.
Thank you, David. Colin Drake.
Hi, Colin Drake. I am with SDOT, and I coordinate the interdepartmental technical team that's working on the WSBLE project.
Thank you, Colin. And then Lucien.
I'm Lucien Ong. I work with Vera at the Office of Planning and Community Development.
Thank you, Lucien. David Goldberg from OPCD is also going to be presenting today. I don't see him on the call yet, but when he presents, we'll have him introduce himself. David Goldberg is a community planner and staff in our Equitable Development Initiative division within OPCD and has done extensive planning in North Delridge. All right, I'll turn it over to Sound Transit staff.
Thanks, Vera. I'll take it on. I'm Kate Lichtenstein with Sound Transit. I'm in an acting project director role. I'll be just doing some intro and then I'll have to take off for another meeting. And then today with me presenting, we have Sloan Dawson, Jason Hampton, and Dirk Baker. I'll start with Sloan, and then I think Dirk and Jason are having a little trouble connecting in, but we will see if we can continue to work through that. So Sloan, go ahead.
Sure, thanks, Kate. Yeah, so you all know me. Good to see you again today. This is going to be a big agenda. We have a lot of material to cover, but my name is Sloan Dawson. My role in the project has been really focused on station planning and urban design. So I'll be presenting primarily in the Delridge station alternatives, and then my colleagues Jason Hampton and Dirk, if they're able to join, will be also talking about the Duwamish Bridge and the guideway alignments and sort of physicality of that moving through Delridge and transitioning to the junction. And we're sort of trying to resolve behind the scenes exactly what their issue is. So I think we have a little bit of time, hopefully, to get that resolved before we get to that part of the agenda. So maybe we could start with the background.
Are you kicking us off then, Sloan?
Yeah, I can kick this off.
Great,
Right. Great. So we've already done our introductions. Our agenda this morning is going to look kind of similar to how we've done it in the past. So we'll have some quick project orientation, including some background for new commissioners on the overall sort of project, and then we'll hear from the city on related initiatives in the Delridge station area. And then we'll move on to the Duwamish crossing first, and then the Delridge station and guideways, sort of following the movement over to West Seattle. So starting with project orientation, I'll turn it over to Kate.
Thank you. You've probably seen this before, but wanted to just quickly orient you to where we are in the West Seattle and Ballard Link Extensions project. As you can see, we are still in the planning phase. We're kind of nearing the latter half of the planning phase, which began in 2017 and goes through 2023. After planning, we would expect to enter design through 2027 and begin construction 2026 to 2027 through 2037 to 2039, with service starting in West Seattle in 2032 and to Ballard in 2037 through 2039. Just noting that that schedule, the 2037 date would be to Smith Cove, and then there's an affordability gap that if it's not closed would extend the Smith Cove to Ballard section to open in 2039. So next slide, please. So just a little closer on the planning phase, we're in the environmental review process. We've published our draft EIS in January and have a public comment period, a 90-day public comment period, which goes through April 28th. We expect after receiving public comment, we've been doing a lot of outreach, and in June expect that the Sound Transit Board, based on understanding the analysis in the draft EIS and hearing public comment, would confirm or modify the preferred alternative. So that's really the big milestone in front of us, confirming or modifying the preferred alternative to then be studied in the final EIS, which we expect to publish in 2023. After publication of the final EIS is when the board would select the project to be built and there'd be a federal record of decision. Next slide, please. So these are the alternatives that we're studying in the draft EIS. We have alternatives in pink that are preferred alternatives going into the draft EIS, brown alternatives, colored brown, and preferred alternatives with third-party funding. And in blue, we have other draft EIS alternatives. We'll be focusing today on the West Seattle portion of the project down at the south end of this map. Next slide, please. And I wanted to just quickly touch on the engagement that's been going on, really intensive engagement during the the draft EIS process. The top line here, we've had virtual hearings and public meetings. In March, we have a community advisory group, or actually one for each segment, so 4 community advisory groups that have been hearing about and providing feedback on the project as we've gone along. We're in the 5th series of those meetings. You can see in the April timeframe there. So we have, after we complete the meetings this month, one more set of meetings in May. And then expect to be at the System Expansion Committee in April, later this month, with a workshop talking about draft EIS and cost savings ideas. There'd be public comment summary once we've heard everything, reporting back on public comment in May, and then again in June, the System Expansion Committee and the Sound Transit Board would consider the action to confirm or modify the preferred alternative. And that's all I have. So, oh, sorry, one more slide. Just wanting to note that there's a strong focus on equity in the draft EIS, and we've been partnering with the City of Seattle to do a racial equity toolkit report. As we've gone along, we began in the alternatives development phase, and in this phase, we have a draft report out for review in parallel with the draft EIS, and that will be updated based on comments received on the draft EIS. And all of this is available for review on our Participate Online site. All right, I think that's what I have. Next, I'll pass it over to the city. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kate. So I'll just be queuing up folks as we go through the city initiatives. So Betsy is up next from the city. Go ahead, Betsy. And if you would advance to the next slide.
Okay, yeah, next slide, please. As I mentioned, my name is Betsy Lyons, and I work for Seattle Public Utilities, and I was asked to provide a little bit of information just about Longfellow Creek watershed and what some of the work that we are doing in that area is, and some of the issues we want Sound Transit and the Design Commission to be thinking about as they evaluate the different options. Next slide, please. So SPU currently has 3 large projects in the Longfellow Creek watershed, and these are significant investments that the city is making in this area. Starting in the most upstream portion, sort of the bottom of that map, we have our Longfellow Starts Here project, and that's a project that's going to be looking at reducing combined sewer overflows into the creek and trying to make a number of improvements to the watershed and community access to the creek in that area. And then the small dark circle within that larger purple circle, thank you. That's our Longfellow Creek Natural Drainage Project, and that is going to go to construction relatively soon. There's 3 sites there where SPU is looking at making improvements to natural drainage, putting in some green stormwater infrastructure to improve water quality. And then it's also working with SDOT on some pedestrian improvements, including new sidewalks and also a new pedestrian bridge across the creek to kind of help with that east-west connectivity that we know is important in that neighborhood. And then lastly, and our most recent project that we are just getting started is our Longfellow Creek Natural Flood Storage Project. So if you look at the kind of inset on the right side, there's 5 sites that we're going to be looking at as potential for floodplain restoration as a mechanism for adding flood storage in that area. So the northernmost of those sites is the West Seattle Golf Course and Genesee Street area, which is right near one of the Sound Transit alternatives. Okay, next slide. You know, one of the reasons that we're doing this is I think we all know there's been a lot of problems within the Longfellow Creek watershed. You know, there was a lot of historic development in that area, you know, much of it which happened before we really understood the ecology of that area. And it's really left the creek very dismantled at some point. In some places, you know, the creek has been eliminated or filled in. And that development, plus I'd say, you know, decades of underinvestment in this area has led to a lot of problems. We have a lot of combined sewer overflows, localized flooding of roadways, significant channel erosion and incision, like this picture on the right. It looks like a ditch, but that's actually Longfellow Creek that's been put in a ditch when the road system was put in, and habitat degradation. So the projects that we're doing in that area are an attempt to address some of these problems and to put some new investments back into that area in a way that will, you know, improve the ecology, the flooding, and then I think more significantly provide, you know, healthy habitats and access to new green space in that area. Next slide. So just a couple notes on some major utilities to consider for the Andover Street alternative and the Genesee Street. The purple dot on the left side is the location of a CSO detention pipe that needs to be protected in place. If you look at the map on the inset on the right, that area is in purple. That's Genesee Street that's going east-west through that purple box, which is where a detention pipe is. You can also see that there's a lot of King County infrastructure. The green lines are King County sewer, pink are SPU sewer lines, and then blue are drainage and or creek assets. So a number of major utilities that we need to be thinking about. And next. This is just a close-up of that area around Andover Street in the vicinity of the proposed station, where we have detention pipe, and then we also have a number of other structures that need to be accessible for maintenance. Next slide. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of context on salmon habitat and fish use. This is one of the city's 5 main streams that support salmon, and, you know, one of the larger ones. And you can see if you look at the image on the left, red shows areas of low in-stream habitat quality, green is high quality. So much of the system really is in, you know, relatively poor shape. There are some good sections of habitat, mostly within parks property. And historically, this whole watershed was open to migrating salmon. Today, those salmon have a difficult time getting into those areas and the decent habitat that does remain. The map in the middle shows the number of fish passage barriers that we are aware of, and you can see the red are SPU barriers and orange are other ones. And if it's a solid circle, that means it's considered a complete barrier to fish. Right now, based on the data that SPU has and has been collecting over the years, we see Chinook salmon and some of the other salmon, you know, aren't able to get beyond the golf course. Our Genesee Street crossing is a barrier there. So as we look at new development, you know, we have an opportunity to think about how we can, you know, both improve that habitat and improve fish passage, you know, within the watershed. Okay, next slide. So just from a utility perspective, some siting considerations that we wanted to, you know, put out there is that, you know, we have a lot of infrastructure that we need to make sure there's significant setbacks from that existing infrastructure. So this, you know, CSO storage tank is one. We also know that a lot of that piped creek infrastructure in culverts that are fish passage barriers in the future over time will need to be upgraded to meet current fish passage standards. So we want to make sure that work that happens in that area doesn't preclude us from making those future improvements. We also know there's a lot of opportunity and to improve water quality. Most of you have probably heard about this salmon pre-spawn mortality. We know that road runoff is impacting salmon, and so as we direct any new flows into the creek, we want to make sure that those are treated flows and that we're not sending untreated stormwater into Longfellow Creek. There's also, I'd say, as we think about impacts and any potential mitigation or synergistic partnerships, there's a lot of opportunities to improve fish passage, to improve the stream habitat, wetlands, and then floodplains restoration within the vicinity of the areas proposed for the stations. And then lastly, kind of an obvious one, but there's a number of stormwater code requirements that need to be considered, in any project. Next slide. This is just a visual of some of those opportunities that I just mentioned. The top circle there is Andover Street, and the lower one is Genesee Street. So within the Andover, corridor, we want to make sure that our CSO pipes are protected. There might also be an opportunity to daylight a portion of the Pipe Creek that just is to the north of there, sort of between Andover and the West Seattle Bridge. And then at Genesee Street, to the south, there's a number of opportunities that could be considered just depending on the planning and the options. So we know there's a need for improved fish passage improvements with our culvert that's beneath Genesee Street. There's also a significant portion of that roadway that's a regulated, the roadway embankment itself is a regulated dam. So, and that causes some of the constrictions in the creek. So removing that dam reduces obligations for maintenance inspections, but also could have fish passage and habitat improvements as well. And then we know there's just in general interest in putting more green stormwater infrastructure in, thinking about how we use and reuse water and how we use it for beneficial purposes and treat it to reduce water quality impacts. I think that is the last of my slides. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Betsy. That was really helpful. And commissioners will have these slides to review after this presentation. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you.
So we can go to the next slide. And David Graves, I believe you're up to talk about parks.
Thanks, Vera, and thanks, Betsy. So much of Longfellow Creek ends up running through our properties, particularly West Seattle Golf Course, that we're looking forward to continue to partner with SPU on making that creek more fish passable. From a Section 4F standpoint, though, as it relates to the Sound Transit project, some of the alternatives on Genesee Street, most of them tend to not have very significant impact on our golf course and golf course operations. There are two tunnel options that put the tunnel portal on the south side of Genesee Street that do have some significant impacts to the golf course. So those are our biggest concerns about how those impact. We'd need to move holes and tee boxes around, and then that impacts the playability and then the viability of the golf course. So that's kind of the biggest issue for us. The Andover Street options don't impact our golf course operations in the same way. So those, we've been working with city folks on looking at some of those options as far as, how much more beneficial those might be, with the caveat too that we want to, make sure we're in line with Betsy and SPU's concerns about, future fish patterns, but while also being sensitive to the tax project on the neighborhood. So. And that's a quick snapshot of kind of our view on the related to 4F impacts.
Great, thank you, David. All right, next slide, please. Thank you. David Goldberg, you are here. And I'm wondering if you would just be willing to introduce yourself briefly and then share with us your work on the North Delaware Action Plan.
Great. Hi, David Goldberg with Seattle Office of Planning and Community Development. I've had the privilege of working on both Delridge neighborhood plans, first in 1999, and then in 2014 through 2016, we finally published the latest North Delridge Action Plan in 2018. At that time, were coordinating quite extensively with SDOT on the rapid ride line there, as well as SPU, to try to kind of leverage these projects with improvements in the area, and that was quite successful. We considered at that time whether we should start some elements of station area planning, but after discussions with SDOT and so forth, we deferred a lot of the elements that might be considered in stationary planning to the processes that will be coming forward. What we did do is create an overall framework for how Delridge should develop. I usually begin my discussion by saying that one of the strongest organizations in the neighborhood, the Delridge Neighborhoods Development Association, is very clear that the word neighborhoods is plural. Delridge is not one neighborhood, but a number of neighborhoods. People talk about their assets when they talk about Delridge. They talk about the open space. They talk about Longfellow Creek. They talk about the people. What they also talk about is what's missing. There's a sense of that Delridge as a whole is a series of small pockets of residential areas that has very limited opportunities to come together, and usually has to leave. People in the neighborhood usually have to leave their neighborhood to get their services and goods and retail goods. So what they talk about in general is creating places where people can come together and where they can build on the assets of their communities. The North Delridge Action Plan talks about several key themes. These themes share a common thread of health equity. Our health equity lens that we used in this project talks about creating healthy people and families, strong organizations, and a healthy environment. And that theme runs throughout the plan. The areas that the plan focuses on is developing dynamic neighborhood destinations that I'll speak to in a second, supporting diverse and engaged communities, improving access to affordable and healthy food, the areas of food desert, creating active transportation choices, nurturing a healthy Longfellow Creek, much of which Betsy talked about, and leveraging parks and cultural facilities to support a healthy community. So what does this mean? It means that there are both assets that can take a leading role in creating a health community, and there are also pretty significant interventions that the community would like the city and others to make in order to create a stronger environment. They focused on, you can go to the next slide. So here you can see the themes 1 through 6. These are the kind of the topical themes for the neighborhood plan. And then you can see these circles on the right in the map. The circles represent the areas that have possibility or existing resources that can be strengthened to achieve the goals on the left. The 2 circles intersecting on the top are the Andover Junction area. And below that, thank you for circling that, below that is the cultural and kind of junction. Those are really important. The Andover Junction, the objective for that area is to create a stronger employment base and services for the community. It's often been viewed that that area is kind of underperforming its potential. The area to the south really speaks to the assets of the community. The Youngstown Cultural Center is there, the community center is there, large parks and open spaces are there. Together they work as the potential area for a significant gathering space and a significant place for community to get the services and goods that they need on a daily basis. So the plan speaks to a number of things that we could do to strengthen employment growth, retail and services in the Andover area, and to connect and strengthen the park resources and the cultural opportunities in the circle just below. The outcome that the community wants, and I think will shape the stationary planning as we move forward, and hopefully as shaped the consideration of the alternatives, is to really leverage the investment in light rail to do both of these things: increase employment and housing opportunities, access to goods and services, and strengthen ties to the cultural and park resources that are available in the area, really creating for Delridge a destination and a place where people can feel as though they have a common kind of neighborhood feel. And I think I'll leave it there, and I'm sure there'll be questions later on. Is there one more slide that shows a close-up, I think? No.
That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. We rely quite a bit on David's expertise and depth of work in Delridge, and so glad to have you here today. So I think you might have noticed in that most recent map that was up, that diagram that David shared, that the Delridge corridor is not just focused on the station area in the North Delridge area, but it extends south into, across High Point into the Westwood Highland Park area. And that's sort of an interesting differentiator about the Delridge station area, is that the way that we're thinking about it is not just about the station area itself, but about the bus shed. So we're expecting quite a few people to be transferring by bus from South Delridge at the station. And Lucian will talk a little bit more about that right after this slide, but I wanted to share that because it directly relates to some of our racial equity toolkit outcomes. So the racial equity toolkit is a joint effort between the city and Sound Transit. It's a commitment to documenting the opportunities and potential burdens on communities of color, and then doing what we need to do as agencies to minimize harm and maximize benefit for communities of color for this project. So I'll just share briefly what the specific racial equity toolkit outcomes are for the Delridge station. So the first at the bottom of your screen there is an excellent transfer experience, including bus and rail integration options for racial equity toolkit community desired enemy, and options for RET community desired amenities provided at the station. So that excellent transfer experience is an effort to communicate that we expect quite a few people to be arriving at this station from South Delridge, people who will be transferring, and one of our design goals is to make sure that that experience is smooth, that it feels safe, that people feel a sense of belonging in that transfer experience, so that it's not recreating sort of a white space or a stressful space, but it's creating a space that people feel comfortable moving through. And then secondly, the equitable transit-oriented development that will be serving the community, that has long been, as David mentioned, a goal to have equitable, affordable housing within the neighborhood. And given the opportunity that the land acquisitions create, and also the potential catalytic sort of activity that a new light rail station will create within the Delridge neighborhood, we're looking very closely at equitable TOD opportunities within Delridge to make sure that people who currently reside within the neighborhood and nearby, who may experience or find themselves at risk of displacement because of new development pressure, that there will be opportunities for people to continue to live in that neighborhood. And I'll pass it over to Lucian on the next slide.
Next slide, please. Thanks, Vera. So as Vera kind of alluded to, the Sound Transit has projected that up to 90% of the ridership for Delridge Station will arrive by transit, and by that we mean by bus. And most likely, most of them will come from areas further south. So the area further south obviously contain the Delridge Way corridor, which, as most of you know, is being converted into the Rapid Ride H line. So that continues south all the way to Westwood Highland Park, as well as White Center and Burien. And so that corridor is obviously a big driver for ridership. But King County Metro Connect, the long range plan Metro Connect, also plan to convert the 16th Avenue corridor, which on this map is 1042, into a frequent transit corridor, which means the bus will run at least every 15 minutes throughout the day. And that corridor serves the ridge to the east of the ridge way, which is essentially a valley. Along the ridge there is South Seattle Community College, and as well as and because it's a ridge, it's even though by distance it's only half-mile apart from the ridge way, it's not connected at all. Just because, so sometimes we are often kind of get tricked by maps thinking the two corridors very close. You don't need two frequent bus lines, but that's definitely not the case here when the neighborhoods are disconnected. And again, so the whole corridor serves a much higher portions of communities of colors and low-income communities, especially as you go further south into the Westwood Highland Park area, near the city limit near White Center. So as a city overall, the community color is about 35 to 40%, but in Westwood Highland Park, it's about 65% communities of color. And then also more than 1/3 of the households qualify for low-income transit fare, which is quantified as at 200% federal poverty level. So that's the people that can currently qualify for the Orca Lift program. So that's the metric we're using. So we just really want to ensure that our thinking about where their registration is, as Vera alluded to in the red outcomes, is really going to make sure this community further south can actually benefit from it. So comfortable, safe, and intuitive transit integration, and it's really key to serving all this rider transferring from further south. And yeah, and as it stays right on top there, equitable transit access is really imperative for this community. And I think I'll pass it back to Vera for the next.
Thank you, Lucien. Okay, so on that note that the transfer experience is significant and very important at this station, we've been working on the planning side within the city and also with Sound Transit to help try and start a definition and advance a shared understanding of what high quality transfer experience includes. So the high level concepts listed here are safety and perceived safety. So both physical safety, safety from traffic. Delridge Way is can be a very fast street for cars and other modes. And so thinking about the safety of pedestrians and other users or riders accessing the station, but also the sense of perceived safety from crime, physical bodily harm, potentially. So we're thinking about how to make the station feel like a safe place where there's activated spaces adjacent to the pathway from a transfer, a bus stop to the station entrance. So activated spaces, landscaping, lighting, those kinds of things. First and foremost, for safety, we're thinking about a sense of belonging for all users with a focus on communities of color. So making sure that light rail transit specifically, feels like a place where communities of color feel safe, welcome, and that they are a part of the system. You can see a couple other of the elements in this perceived safety and safety that we have sort of listed here. So bus stops that do not require crossing arterial roads, and like I mentioned, active pedestrian-oriented uses. This is, I'll just say, this is not the full list. We have a whole set of design guidelines that will be aimed at realizing this sort of optimal transfer environment, but this is sort of like a little brief snapshot. So then after safety is comfort. So we've talked about this in previous slides, is making sure that if you are making the long journey by bus and transferring here, that if you need to, if a rider needs to be able to access things like childcare or a bathroom or to pick up a cup of coffee or some breakfast or their groceries, we'd like to work with Sound Transit and other developers in the area to see about providing user amenities either within the station itself or an adjacent TOD that provides the kinds of rider comforts that people will need on their journey between South Delridge and perhaps downtown or the east side. Making sure that the bus and rail waiting areas are visible, comfortable, that there's sufficient space. Another transit integration principle that we're advancing is speed. So there's a lot about how the buses work and how they'll work around this station and how they'll be oriented to make sure that the transfer process is quick. So if buses are having to wait, a while and they're, and how they circulate around the station and reach a station entrance, we want to try and minimize that as much as possible so that folks are not spending a lot of time waiting to get off the bus and transfer to the light rail. And then finally, accessibility. So making sure that accessing the station and finding, one's way from a bus stop to a station entrance is intuitive. It doesn't rely on people being able to read English, so that the wayfinding feels like an intuitive and obvious process. That the path is free from obstructions for user vulnerabilities, and that the fare transfer process is intuitive and seamless in both directions. I think everyone's had their share of transfer debacles, and I think working with the the user experience program at Sound Transit to make sure that people are able to transfer from bus to rail without feeling concerned that they are not doing the making the transition in the proper way. We can go on to the next slide.
Vera, how many more slides do you have? We're getting
This
close
is
to
the
time
last.
for this first section. Okay, great.
This is last. Thanks for checking in. Okay, so finally the ETOD, so the equitable TOD opportunity at Delridge is in several of the alternatives is pretty significant, at least with respect to agency TOD, so the land that Sound Transit will be acquiring and then surplusing for use as TOD is somewhat significant. OPCD, along with SDOT and DON, I think you may be familiar. In 2019, we applied for and were granted a $1.75 million FTA TOD pilot grant that we're administering to advance an equitable TOD strategy. And that strategy is rooted in a community advisory group that's really made up of folks who are not the frequent flyers and like the development community. They're people who draw from a variety of different abilities and backgrounds, and we're working on this very deliberate, intentional process through our Equitable Development Initiative division within OPCD to develop a strategy around TOD that specifically focuses on community ownership, sort of community determined realization of TOD that serves communities' needs and is not necessarily beholden entirely to sort of private market demands or urgency. And so this feels like a strong, deliberate, intentional process that we're working through to make sure that the Delridge TOD process is realized in a way that really benefits community. One thing to note is that the Delridge station is not located currently within a designated urban growth area. We are working on our comprehensive plan major update right now, which will be updated in 2024, but the work is being done right now to update that. And I think there's some concern about, how do we address the Delridge station area and its current zoning, its current land uses, and make sure that the growth that occurs there serves community that's compatible with this new light rail investment, but doesn't completely, doesn't displace the people who it's meant to serve. And so there's this pretty, I would say, intentional and thoughtful process that we're trying to take on right now to make sure that what change does come to Delridge is something that is ushered in part by community and helps realize their vision. And that would help. One element of that would be potentially modifying the Delridge sort of land use growth strategy to say we may make this a growth area, but there are some caveats that come with that. And then I already mentioned the outcome of equitable TOD and desired amenities at the station. So I will stop there and I think pass it on over to our facilitators for discussion.
Great, thank you, Vera. So commissioners, we are, again, this is going to be a tight morning. First, I don't see if there's anyone from the public that is attending and would like to make comment. Please use the raise your hand function. I see 3 attendees, but I think they might all be from the city. And then given that we just had a city presentation, I don't know if there's anybody else from the city that wanted to add anything, but if so, please raise your hand. Okay, well then I'll pass it over to Elaine to start our summary comments and questions. As we did previously, we should really be, we're not going to do 2 rounds. If you have a question or comments to make, do that in the same period and really try and think to stay within a couple minutes because of the length of the presentation this morning.
Yeah, agreed there, Vanita. So what because if we want to get through the Duwamish Crossing, I think, and the station comments and questions will have to be brief. And if there are additional comments or questions, we can include them in our follow-up comments that we'll send out after the meeting. So I heard a number of subject areas, including the Longfellow Creek. There was fish passage and utility improvements. The Delridge community was another area of interest, racial equity considerations, transit integration, and TOD. So there's a lot there to unpack, but so I would suggest if there's 1 or 2 of those areas that have special interest or you have questions about them, please focus your comments. And we will start with Amalia.
Thanks, Elaine. I'll stay in my lane and stay in the transportation focused question. So I just wanted to say I appreciated all the conversation about equity and access and TOD. And I think one of the pieces that is missing from a transportation planning perspective is with those land use changes, and particularly in the Delridge options, you're really fundamentally changing the street classifications and street typology and the design guidance that's associated with that, which is also going to very much change the context. So in addition to having like the land use or the building type change, you're really changing how that street is functioning in the design guidelines that the city has. And so I feel like there's been a little bit of a disconnect to get all of the modes accommodated in some of those areas. They're neighborhood yield streets effectively, and those streets do not have capacity, nor do they have the existing infrastructure to support transit, direct transit access. We've seen that happen and had some lessons learned around other stations that are operating now. There's no need to get down into the details of it, but it even like the pavement depth and if a bus can drive on the pavement based on its existing depth. So I think that those things need to really be accounted for as we're thinking about costs and mitigation opportunities, and where that is impacted by how that affects the actual service to the transit station, especially when some of these areas you have to go up an elevation. So all of that transfer time and all of that level of service at the individual stations, relative again to the impacts and to your point about who are we serving and who's going to be here in the future and how accessible and how integrated are their lives in that station. So that's just a kind of a broad statement. So I guess my question is ties back to how has you know, has those conversations been started with SDOT? Because I think that's still an integral part of, you know, the comp plan is one piece, but there's a body of work associated with SDOT that would need to happen for those changes to be in place, and those changes take time, just like the land use changes.
Is it helpful to respond at this time, or are we primarily making comments?
If you're able to respond to a question briefly, that would be great. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sorry that SDOT couldn't be here today. SDOT Urban Design is working closely with us and with Sound Transit to develop street design concepts going forward that will sort of reestablish some of the expectations for what streets can carry. And that's actually our next sort of big body of work, is to look at streets around each station and say what, you know, types of modes are we talking about on these streets. We know that council, for example, has to adopt or has to approve of new you know, bus use on specific streets. And so there's a big body of work ahead of us. We're sort of still in the initial design and planning phase, but a couple of the efforts that are involved are the design guidelines, so that will help you know, help the design commission, you all evaluate whether or not Sound Transit has sort of use these guidelines, or whether Sound Transit has achieved the design approach that is sufficient for you know, the types of use that will be around each station. So the design guidelines, we're updating our Streets Illustrated manual. So that's something that you all are probably familiar with, that, you know, tells us what kinds of streets are required around specific types of uses. That will be updated. And then these street design concepts that I mentioned earlier. So there is a heavy emphasis on making sure that the capacity of the streets around stations is sufficient. And SDOT will be in future briefings and will be able to speak to that more directly.
Thank you. Anita, you are up next for questions, comments.
Great. Thanks, Elaine. David, I had a question about the park impacts. As I understand it, if there's any loss of park property, there, you know, Sound Transit needs to provide an equivalent area. Is that correct?
It is under 4F, and also under the city's initiative 42, which says you can't use parkland for non-park purposes. So yeah, I mean, it's a big deal, and Sound Transit will have to find some replacement property.
Yeah, and is that a collaborative process in which your SPR is looking at this as opportunity as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think some of it, you know, I think it's hard until Sound Transit really settles on a preferred alternative. We haven't spent a lot of time on that discussion, because if, you know, if there's an alternative that takes a bunch of park property, but it ends up, you know, not a preferred alternative, then we don't necessarily need to spend a whole lot of time on it. So it will, you know, we'll move forward on those negotiations as the preferred alternative becomes clear. And it's really what its permanent impact. So there is some of those alternatives that have impacts to our park properties during construction, and we can, you know, that stuff we can work around depending on the scope of those impacts. But really, the big issue will be, you know, any permanent takes of park property.
And I'm curious, with the golf course, and I guess in general with the golf courses that Seattle Parks and Recreation manages, is there any future thinking about these properties?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, you know, some of our golf courses have perimeter trails, but it has been front of mind for the last couple of years for us, is how do we make our golf courses more accessible and make them feel more like a park and not, you know, some semblance of exclusivity. So that is, you know, just those are ongoing discussions we've had internally about how we make them better and more accessible to folks beyond just the, you know, kind of golf public.
Great, thank you. I had a couple questions about the, it was towards the end of the presentation talking about the future rapid line planning, I think specifically, and noting that that location of the South Delridge Station is really critical to be able to work with, the best transfer opportunities. Is that lending itself to a particular alternative then, or has, curious from the Metro's perspective, if anyone is able to answer that. If not, that's fine.
Anita, this is Sloan. I think that we'll be able to speak to some of that in our presentation of the Delridge alternatives. We've been working very closely with Metro as part of our co-planning program to make sure that, regardless of which alternative moves forward, that transit integration is as seamless as possible. And that may involve, in some cases, deviations. But yeah, unfortunately, we don't have Metro here today to sort of lend a more subjective comment, if you will. We expect that they might be submitting a letter or comment to that effect, though.
Okay, great. I'll stop there with questions, and I'll just make a couple comments. I think it would be great for us to look at this as an opportunity, as SPU highlighted, for what projects from an open space restoration improvement to Longfellow Creek can we capitalize on within this section of the corridor. And with that, also, with our open space and West Seattle golf course being so large, where are the, how can we turn this into a positive, knowing that there could be some impacts in these different alternatives. So future thinking about those connections between the open spaces and improvement to fish passage altogether is something I think is a really great opportunity here, and how that's going to connect to, people in the neighborhood to these resources as well in a better way. And I will pass on to Matt.
I don't have any comments at this time. Thank you.
Great. Elizabeth, you are up next.
I am. Thanks. I have a couple of questions for Vera. I believe you spoke about advisory boards, about advisory committees that are in place for each location, potential location. I'm wondering, first of all, how long do those advisory groups retain their function? Are they going to go all the way into the 2030s, or what's their scope in terms of time throughout this process? And secondly, also related to the advisory committees, and looking at Lucien's map, have you been able to have your advisory committees reflect the demographics of these neighborhoods and users? I think it's for Vera.
Yeah, I think actually this might be a question for Kate, or for, if she's still on, if she's not, maybe for Sloan or another. I think those are the community advisory groups that
it was Kate, I'm sorry,
mentioned earlier. Yeah, I'll let someone from Sound Transit address that.
I think Kate has had to, actually, she's doing meeting hopscotch this morning, so she'll be back about 10:30. I'll speak briefly to that. Right now, the intent with convening the CAGs was to advise on the draft EIS, so reviewing the draft EIS and advising on confirming or modifying the preferred alternative. But I don't think a decision has been made about does it continue or does it get reconstituted in the future. I imagine that is something that is possible, certainly. But I don't think it's been decided per se yet. And we, in terms of composition of the committee, unfortunately don't know off the top of my head the total number of committee members, but it is representative of both the station areas as well as the corridor that feeds into the Delridge station. So we have a couple folks who live in High Point, for instance, and further south on Delridge Way, to represent that perspective of folks who might be taking the bus or otherwise traveling a longer distance to access the stations.
Thanks, Lon. That's really helpful. In that vein, I was also impressed by what the detail Betsy gave about Longfellow Creek, and personally, I've been able to trace, walk that whole trajectory for a reason I won't go into. But I think Longfellow Creek is this incredible resource and I'm so glad that SPU is working on this from a scientific viewpoint, but also in thinking about parks. Vinita also spoke about open space, and I'd like to offer additional enthusiasm for those spaces being looked at as assets and being a part of the decision making that Sound Transit is making. I think they're potent public spaces. They're places that people do cross the creek. There are schools, there are a variety of ages, a variety of neighborhoods that are actually knitted together by that creek, and the improvements will I think reinforce that. Betsy referred to synergistic partnerships around these questions, and I hope that those open spaces, while not being official parks, will actually get a lot of attention as very important civic gathering and knitting together of communities spaces. And with that, I will pass it on to Pooja.
Thank you. So there were, I'm not sure who this question is for, but there were mentions of course, the locally owned businesses that are being disrupted by this work. Also providing benefit to local communities and communities of color. And then I really love the idea of incorporating amenities within the new stations. And I was wondering if there's any thought to partnering with some of the owners of the disrupted businesses and providing them space within those new stations to rebuild their businesses if they're, appropriate business types for that location.
So I can start to speak to that, Pooja, and our later slides actually will provide more opportunity to discuss that or to show where the opportunities might be spatially. But in short, yes, generally our approach to assisting business owners, property owners, residents when the project has to acquire property is to make sure that folks are, identify a place to relocate to, and there are resources that Sound Transit provides to actually, directly facilitate that relocation. The question is, in terms of the return, if you will, to the development or other spaces that might be created through the construction. And that's certainly a possibility. We have worked to do that in other station areas, and I imagine here at several other places along the project, there would be a similar opportunity. That does require some partnership, though, with the city, and particularly when it comes to residences, given fair housing laws, et cetera, we can't necessarily say that, these housing units would be reserved for folks. But we can do things like affirmative marketing and other interventions that, through partnership can really facilitate that right of return once construction is complete of the station as well as an utility.
Thank you.
Great. And Erica?
Hi, thanks everyone. I also really appreciated the comments regarding Longfellow Creek. And furthermore, I was a bit concerned there wasn't any mention of the Duwamish as a whole. This is the station that will be closest to the Duwamish River. And from an equity standpoint, which we've heard from the Shape Our Water SPU project and the Longfellow Creek project, planning all the way south to White Center and beyond that, folks are feeling and historically have been very, very disconnected from the only river in Seattle. And this is a really great opportunity to draw on that connection, bring people closer to it, and give a more equitable access to that space. So in the way that we're talking about the golf course and the parks system of Longfellow Creek, I would love to hear more about the connections down to the Duwamish River. It's used in that area very heavily for fishing by a very diverse population, and considering how these different alternatives will impact that activity and the access to that recreation. I would love to see more of and hear what discussions have been sort of occurring around that access point. So if folks from the Parks Department or SPU have thoughts on that, that would be great. And then I also, from the community planning standpoint, this is a very small scale community. As you all know, it's really very single family residentially oriented, and the scale of those single family residences are quite small and provide for sort of naturally existing affordable housing. And so when community planning considerations are taken into account, I was curious if there's been initial thoughts on sort of the missing middle and smaller scale affordable housing sort of options for the area. There's quite a sort of disjointed circumstance just up the ridge towards Avalon and Fauntleroy, where you have a really extreme transition from multifamily to single family. And I think that's been quite problematic, where affordable housing is really centered on corridors in this area. So sort of thinking about how the scale of residences are more are a softer transition is also something that I'd love to hear if people have started to talk about.
Hi, Erica. This is David Graves from Parks. I can jump in at least on some of this. I mean, I think my understanding of the alternatives, when they cross the whether it's North Seattle Bridge or south of the West Seattle Bridge, go over it pretty high, so they don't really impact. There's that fishing spot that's on the north side of the low bridge that a ton of people use, and I don't know that they impact those spots even at all, because I know Sound Transit is trying to stay out of the water. So there's that piece. So concern as it relates to that is once Sound Transit gets closer to Pigeon Point, there's some impacts to that green space there and the trail that goes around Pigeon Point that connects down there. So that's really, I think, where those impacts are is to, and most likely during construction, more so than I think once it's completed. So that is a kind of something we've been watching, is how folks get back and forth around Pigeon Point. I think that's the one area where we see that pinch point and where we see the potential for the most impacts there. And then I think that's a great point about housing. I think that's one of the things that we've been trying to be sensitive to, in that really limiting our comments on impacts to the golf course to those things that are most impactful, because we don't want to, push all the impacts onto the adjacent single family neighborhood to the north of our course. And so, there's some impacts obviously we can live with, and particularly if it doesn't impact that single family neighborhood to the north. And what are really, I think you've hit it, are probably relatively affordable housing still in that area.
Great. Any other questions, comments, Erica?
Nope, I think I'm good. I guess one more comment. I would like to see more a contextual relationship in terms of bike ped connections outside of the valley. That's just it's the obviously main cross of bikes getting down to downtown come through that area. So understanding that a little better would also be wonderful. It's probably an SDOT question.
Great. All right, Jill.
Hi, I'll be really quick. I think I just have one question. And Vera, I'll let you figure out who to direct this to. I heard talk of the culture of the Youngstown Cultural Center, but have any other cultural assets been identified in this North Duwamish area?
That's a good question for David. David, do you want to engage on that?
Thank you for that question. As we mentioned, Delridge is very spread out, and what we heard when we working with community liaisons during the neighborhood planning process was the desire for facilities like the community center, like the large playground and park, like Youngstown Cultural Arts Center, to continue to expand programs and physical elements that reflect and support the cultures that are up and down Delridge Way. So Youngstown Cultural Arts Center does a wonderful job of connecting with the various cultures. The community center does a lot to connect. In further down south, I know the library does as well. The culture that Erica spoke to is the one that maybe is the most made invisible. The continued indigenous presence on those lands. The land itself is often expressed and the rivers are often expressed as a cultural element for those communities. So I think what we see is that there are existing cultural centers, and I didn't mention Southwest Youth and Family Services, which is going to be moving, but we're likely to see a similar agency move into the space down there in North Delridge. There are a number of them. They do a bunch of different programming and physical activities. Lastly, as I'm talking, other things that are occurring to me. Camp Long does a fair bit of cultural programming, and then the partnership with Green Seattle and the Nature Conservancy does a lot of work with different groups, including East African communities up at High Point. So there is a lot of stuff that may not be immediately visible to folks, but they exist and they're interwoven in the North Delridge area.
Great, thanks. I think when we look at the location of these stations, there's some question about, is a station directly adjacent to potential cultural uses good, or is getting it a little bit away so that those uses can continue to develop? I mean, I think that's one of the kind of tipping point questions here. So that's why I asked that. I also agree that the land and topography is part of it. And I really appreciate and want to just reemphasize what Elizabeth and Benita said. The Longfellow Creek presentation was really impressive about water quality and the quality of, where the creek is daylighted. Being able to build on that and talk about access to it in open space would just make that a so much more complete story to tell when we talk about this neighborhood. So that's great. Thanks. Elaine, I don't know who's next. So
I think I'm next. Molly wasn't able to join us this morning. And I will also echo being enthusiastic about some of the improvements to Longfellow Creek and some of the fish passage, utility connections, and really trying to use those as opportunities to make them more civic destinations or accessible to people in the city. I just had one question. I wasn't clear on how far, like for the Delridge neighborhood and the area that we were showing, further to the south, like the area that's, we're really trying to connect to this initial station. What is the distance that we're looking at from the southern portion of what was being referred to as the North Delridge area to the light rail?
I'm going to jump in here. This is David Goldberg. I should know that, and at one time I did know that answer. So I'm going to speak to it kind of rather than a specific mileage, but as experience. The library, the community centers, the Youngstown Cultural Center all speak to their programs and activities are accessed by communities all the way down to and including White Center. So the daycares at the community center speak of people coming in the morning and dropping their kids off in the back at home, picking them up. Same with the library and the So the distance, while it's probably in the 3 to 4 mile range to the city limits, is the experience of people in terms of the connectivity includes, I would say, at least as far down as White Center.
Okay. But I mean, I just, I think as folks have been pointing out, that connection in that corridor is going to be really critical, I think, for that line, so that we're providing opportunities for people in that area. So I'd like to look at that more. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Sound Transit so that we can continue on with bridge discussions.
All right, thank you. Great discussion on a lot of big issues and opportunities that we've been grappling with as we're developing the alternatives for Delridge. We're going to look first at the Duwamish Crossing, which is of course directly related. And I'm going to ask Jason Hampton, who I think is joining us from phone today. And Jason, just call out whenever you're ready to advance.
Yes, Lon, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Cool, perfect. So I think we're on slide 26. I'm going to advance on my own because I can't see the screen.
And Jason, if you want to quickly introduce yourself to the commission, that would be great.
Of course, yeah. My name is Jason Hampton. I'm with Sound Transit. I'm a high capacity development manager, and my role in the project is the segment manager for the Duwamish, Delridge, and West Seattle Junction segments. Thanks. Can we go to 27, please? So I'm going to start off by just offering a bit of background on where some of the information that you'll see in this presentation can be found in the draft EIS. All of our conceptual engineering design drawings are included in Appendix J of the DEIS. These designs reflect about a 10% design. We have these design drawings for the entire corridor, equal for all of the alternatives in the draft EIS. Next slide, please. We're also going to show some visualizations and talk about the visual impact, but I wanted to note where in the draft EIS that can be found. We have a section in Chapter 4, Section 4.2.5 for West Seattle that goes through the visual impact for the Duwamish, the Delridge, and the West Seattle Junction segment, and there's some references to those sections here. We also have a greater detail in Appendix N.2, the Visual and Aesthetics Technical Report. Again, we have some references for where to find that here, and that includes some maps of where sensitive receivers are, where visual impacts would be, as well as a number of visualizations. And there's over 40 visualizations for these three segments. We'll go through a few, several today, but just wanted to note that there's more there with both before and after renderings. Next slide, please. Okay, so visual in the draft EIS, we look at key observation points with simulations. And the locations used for each simulation are called key observation points, or we refer to them as KOPs. And they're used to depict current views toward a proposed project and how the views would change with the project. The observation points represent locations that would be seen by different types of sensitive viewers, and they were selected to serve as representative examples of areas found along the routes of each alternative. And while we only show key observation points and visualizations for some of the representative points, the impact assessment in Chapter 4 and in the appendix includes the entire corridor, regardless of whether a simulation was prepared. Next slide, please. So here I'm going to describe at a high level the alternatives, and then we'll go through and talk a little bit more about these in detail. In the Duwamish segment, we have 3 alternatives that are being studied. All of the alternatives are elevated. I'll begin by describing the preferred alternative, the south crossing alternative, which is shown here in a pink line. The alternative would travel south along the Soto Busway or 5th Avenue South, and it would begin to curve west, crossing the West Seattle Bridge and Spokane Street Bridge approaches around 4th Avenue South. It would continue elevated through to the west over SR 99, over the East and West Waterway and Harbor Island, just south of the West Seattle High Bridge, before curving around the north edge of Pigeon Point in a retained cut, and then traveling south along Delridge Way Southwest. The second alternative I'll describe is here at the bottom of the screen. I should have noted that north is up. And this is the south edge crossing alignment option. It would be the same as the pink preferred all the way until we continue west to about SR 99, where it would veer a little bit further south, crossing Harbor Island on the south tip of Terminal 102, before curving back to the north and around the north edge of Pigeon Point, again to follow Delridge Way south. The third alternative is the north crossing alternative, and it would follow the Soto Busway south, but it would curve to the west, north of the Spokane Street and West Seattle bridges, continuing west over SR 99, the east and west waterways and Harbor Island, before curving to the south around the five-legged intersection near the location of Chelan Cafe to follow Delridge Way south. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through these one at a time, and we'll show a number of things, both simulations and a little bit more information on the key differentiators we're seeing in the draft EIS, as well as some bridge heights. So starting here with the south crossing alternative, I just want to note, I said it was all elevated, but this profile on the bottom shows the heights of certain crossings. So you can see over SR 99, the bridge would be about 80 feet tall. Over the East Waterway, we'd be about 100 feet tall. And over the West Waterway, we'd match the height and the navigation clearance of the West Seattle High Bridge with 140-foot navigation clearance. I'm going to hand it over to Dirk for the next few slides.
I'm hoping that Dirk was able to join us and that he is call-in user 6. Dirk, are you with us?
Dirk, you may have to *6 to unmute.
I unmuted him if
Oh,
he's
thanks.
6.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Dirk, we can hear you. Speak. Now we can't hear you.
Sloan, this is Jason.
How about now?
Yep.
Okay. So my name is Dirk Baker. I'm the corridor design manager for the project. And I'll just go through some of the bridge types that we've evaluated during the process. And we focused on the preferred alternative. Next slide. Can everyone see the segmental box girder?
Yep, we're on the segmental box girder, Dirk.
Okay, slide 35. Sorry about that technical difficulties here, but here's what we call our basic bridge type, which is the segmental box girder. It's very similar to the West Seattle High Bridge that's right to the north of it. I just want to draw your attention to some of the difficulties about crossing Harbor Island, just being in this area with a bridge structure. As you can see from this particular slide, you can see we have a pier in the water with this bridge type. You can see the pier is located a little bit in that alcove there, right north of that railroad bridge. And then the marina is to the east of that. So you can see that's a very difficult location. It's very difficult to make this bridge span longer due to the fact that you do have the railroad bridge there, and this type would become somewhat too long if you have to cross over that railroad bridge. So I'll go on to the next slide. This is what we call the extra dose type bridge. It's not that much, it works a little bit the same as a segmental box girder, but you add cables, free cables to the top. You'll have short towers to hang those cables, those stay cables, but it allows you to span longer. As you can see here, you can see the column lands a little bit to the other side of the railroad bridge. We're still impacting the marina. One of the things with putting a bridge in this area, it's difficult to span the water, but it's also a bit of a puzzle getting the approach spans to these bridges in place, and it all works together. Next slide. This is a steel truss bridge. This is, obviously this is a bridge that can go longer, could potentially span 1,000 feet, and you see we would miss the water entirely. Another advantage of this bridge type is the fact that it's a lot lighter than concrete crossings, in which in this particular area is an advantage because the soils in this area are very, very poor. Harbor Island is somewhat of an artificial island, and competent soils are, in some cases, as deep as 200 feet. There's a, kind of a need to keep the structure as light as possible so that the foundations don't become overwhelmingly big. Next slide, you see what we call the cable stayed bridge, which is also a bridge that has the ability to span more than 1,000 feet. Ideally, it's something between 11 and 1,300 feet, but here it's shown with approximately 11 to 1,200 feet span. As you can see, we're completely out of the water and out of the issues associated with the railroad bridge and the marina. So these are the 4 types that we've evaluated from a technical perspective: ideal bridge type, ideal span lengths, and foundation sizes, and the ability to stay away from obstructions below ground with the foundations that you need for these types of structures. So I think that's my last slide. So with that, I give it back to Jason to go through the views from this location.
Thanks, Dirk. All right, next slide, please. Are we on 39?
We are. Yes.
So for each key observation point, we've included a map with a description of the location. So showing here at the bottom left, we have an inset map that shows the direction that one would be looking. In this case, the viewpoint is the West Seattle Bridge, westbound looking south. And the top left here, we show the existing condition, but we'll name the alternatives on the subsequent slides. So next slide, please. So here we have the preferred south crossing alternative. And again, we're on the West Seattle Bridge, westbound looking south. And this is the view of the segmental box girder bridge with the train. Next slide, please. So here we're moving further west. This viewpoint is 17th Avenue Southwest looking north. There you can see the West Seattle Bridge and its existing condition. Next slide, please. So here we have the south crossing alternative on that segmental box girder bridge. Next slide, please. So for the existing condition at the viewpoint looking north from Southwest Charleston Street and 20th Avenue Southwest, you can see the existing condition with Elliott Bay in the background. Next slide, please. So here the guideway would be around the same level as the West Seattle Bridge, so it would be just below the ridge line there. But you do see that to construct this, some of the trees and vegetation would have to be removed. And this is the same viewpoint for the South Edge crossing alignment option. As you can see on the map on the left, the two alignments line up again as we continue west. Next slide, please. So here, and I mentioned we're going to talk about some of the key differentiators that are found in the draft EIS. And there are many things that we look at in the draft EIS, including elements of the built environment, transportation, and the natural environment. There's only a few things that we touch on here, but there's much more information in the draft EIS, and that looks at both the final operating condition of the project as well as construction. So on the left here, you'll see a number of categories, and I'll go through these for all of the alternatives as we progress through the presentation. We look at project costs, residential displacements, business displacements, and park effects. And these are permanent park effects. So park space that would be removed from the park and reused or repurposed as a transportation facility. And then on the right, we have some callouts associated with this, and then also some other considerations, and I'll note what those are. But starting to the top left for the South Crossing alternative, the project cost would be $1.2 billion. It would have 26 residential units of displacements. It would displace 36 businesses, and then it would have 1.5 acres of permanent park effect. Moving over to the right, you'll see the West Duwamish Greenbelt at the north edge of Pigeon Point would have 1.2 of those 1.5 acres, and the other 0.3 acres would come with impacts to a park at Terminal 102. Of the 36 businesses, 3 of those would be maritime dependent businesses. We note those because we've heard that it could be more challenging to relocate maritime dependent businesses. The blue box is the other considerations. Two of the things I'll point out are Pigeon Point constructability. This is a kind of a catch-all for some of the challenges of constructing the South Crossing at Pigeon Point. There's steep slopes in the area. There's wildlife corridors. We talked about the West Duwamish Greenbelt, and there's also some wetlands. And it's very close to the existing West Seattle Bridge and other infrastructure, so we wanted to note that as a challenge. And then Dirk presented on the alternate bridge types, and he noted the BNSF Historic Bascule Bridge and the location of a pier between that bridge and the West Seattle Bridge. So we note some of the challenges there as well. Finally, at the bottom right, again, we show that profile, just noting that 140-foot clearance again. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to go through a similar presentation for the other draft EIS alternatives, starting with on slide 47, the South Edge Crossing alignment option. So once again, we show the plan view with the alignment, and then at the bottom, we show the profile calling out some of the heights of the guideway. They're similar heights to the pink preferred line that we looked at with 80 feet and 100 feet at SR 99 in the East Duwamish Waterway, and then that 140-foot clearance to match the navigational clearance of the West Seattle Bridge. Next slide, please. So here again, we see the viewpoint, excuse me, from the West Seattle Bridge, westbound looking south. This is the existing condition. The next slide shows the South Edge Crossing alignment option on that segmental box girder bridge, a little bit further south than what we saw with the pink preferred line. Next slide, please. So here again, the viewpoint from 17th Avenue Southwest looking north, the existing condition here. And then that's the next slide, slide 51, the South Edge Crossing alignment option. You can see the proposed view here with the segmental box girder bridge. Here, the viewpoint looking north from Southwest Charleston Street and 20th Avenue Southwest. Next slide, slide 53. We saw this one before where you see Elliott Bay now with the train lower, closer to the West Seattle Bridge. Next slide, please. So here we have a summary on slide 54 of the South Edge Crossing alignment option. I'll go through the column on the left with a project cost of $1.3 billion. Again, 26 residential unit displacements, 29 business displacements, and 1.9 acres of permanent park effects here. So here we would have 1.3 acres of permanent park effect at the north edge of the West Duwamish Greenbelt, and the remaining 0.6 acres would be of that park on Terminal 102. The Pitch and point constructability was mentioned before, and Dirk briefly mentioned the impacts to the marinas with some of the alternatives. This alternative would impact both marinas on Harbor Island. And then Dirk also talked about the preferred alternative and alternate bridge types, showing that some of those would be able to avoid in-water columns. With this alternative, regardless of which bridge type was selected, we would still need in-water columns. So we note that here. And then maritime dependent businesses. Of the 29 business displacements, 5 would be maritime dependent businesses. Next slide, please. So now I'll go through the North Crossing alternative. Again, noting here that the alignment would be similar heights over SR 99 and the east and west waterway as the other alternatives. Next slide, please. So here we show the existing condition at a viewpoint on the West Seattle Bridge looking north. Next slide. And here on slide 57, we show that same viewpoint, but with a segmental box girder light rail bridge north of the existing West Seattle and Spokane Street bridges. Next slide, please. So here again, we look at the viewpoint from 17th Avenue Southwest looking north. You see the West Seattle Bridge there again. And on the next slide on 59, you can see the new light rail bridge north of the West Seattle Bridge, just behind the bridge. Next slide, please. Here again, we look at the viewpoint looking north from Southwest Charleston Street and 20th Avenue Southwest. And on slide 61, we show the same viewpoint, but with a North Crossing alternative shown in the distance. Next slide, please. So on slide 62, we show a similar summary for the North Crossing alternative. Here we would have a project cost of $1.5 billion. We would have no residential displacements with this alignment. We would have 38 business displacements and no park effects, no permanent park effects here. On the plan view here, we show proximity to Port of Seattle Terminal 5 and Terminal 18 container operations with a North Crossing. We also note a T25 restoration site. The Port of Seattle just recently funded design for a restoration site at T25 South. The north alignment could affect that project. Fire Station 14, which also serves as a training facility for the Seattle Fire Department, would be affected by this alternative as well. And then we note of the 38 business displacements, with this alternative, 10 would be maritime dependent businesses. Next slide, please. So here again, we show a similar table with all of the categories on the left. All of the information in this table is what we saw on the earlier slides. It's just arranged as a summary. At the top, we see the alternatives. On the left, we see the categories. Drawing your eyes to the very bottom right of the screen or the slide, I'll note that we have a performance key with darker blue indicating a higher performance in the category and lighter blue indicating the lower performance in the category. So just quickly pointing out some areas where there's higher and lower performance. In project costs, you can see the South Crossing alternative would be the lowest at $1.2 billion, with the North Crossing the highest at 1.5. The lowest for residential displacements would be the North Crossing. Business displacements would be similar with the South and North Crossing alternatives, lower with the South Edge Crossing. However, the highest number of maritime dependent businesses with 10 would be for the North Crossing, and the lowest with 3 for the South Crossing alternative. And in the park effects, both the South and South Edge Crossing would have permanent park effects where the North Crossing would have none. And then the other considerations are listed here as well. So that concludes the summary for the Duwamish segment. I'm going to hand it off to the facilitator for the next slide. Thanks.
And thank you very much, Jason. I'll just ask Colin Drake from the city to walk us through some of the city's evaluation points on this Duwamish Crossing segment. Colin, are you with us?
I'm here.
Great.
I would just jump in on time. We're hoping to start our questions in about 5 minutes. So if possible, be succinct, but
I'll be succinct.
Yeah.
Okay, next slide, please. All right, it's just one slide here. I think there's so much detail that Sound Transit has presented. Really appreciate that. And there are many other considerations that we will work through with Sound Transit as we go along. So, for instance, compatibility with the West Seattle Bridge replacement, not the repair that's going on right now, but the eventual future replacement. But that is not, at least at this moment, seen as a differentiator between the options that are on the table. My understanding is that we have been coordinating with the Sound Transit team on any of the potential Duwamish Crossing options that would be compatible with the West Seattle Bridge replacement. So that's why you don't see it on this slide. Instead, the interdepartmental city team has focused on the impacts to Pigeon Point, as you've heard about here, and then the North Crossing, the potential impacts to the Port of Seattle operations. There are also business displacements for all of the options, but the, and this is an overly simplified slide. And so in sum, since there are business displacements for all of the alternatives, it wasn't seen as a key differentiator. And instead, as the design process proceeds and we take a look at the slope stability and the vegetation, habitat, recreation impacts on Pigeon Point, those will be compared against the impacts to the Port of Seattle operations and the overall maritime industrial impacts north of the bridge. And that's how that's where we see this discussion occurring in terms of selecting a preferred alternative for the Duwamish Crossing. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Elaine, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Thank you. So
I guess, sorry, I should check if there's any public comments. Apologies. Please use the raise the hand function if anybody would like to make comment.
Can I also point commissioners to the chat where we have a little time rundown of the schedule we want to stick to if possible?
Oh, Omar Akari, you have your hand raised. Valerie, can we unmute him or? Go ahead, Omar, if you want to add a comment.
Hello?
We can hear you.
Okay, good. So I'm the Shoreline Streets Program Coordinator for the City of Seattle. I just wanted a very quick comment that was the North Think alternative would run through 4 different street ends probably, and those are prioritized through public access and habitat improvements. So I just wanted to note that is a consideration as well, but the only actual habitat currently is actually on the East Channel, and none of the other improvements have really occurred except for one associated with Bluefields. And I think that Bluefield discussion should be over by September because I think their lease ends. And so the project team should know that should be wrapping up. There was a private consultant doing work on those channels potentially, but then only developed one site. I think on the West Channel on the west side of that bridge. Or was it the east side? I'm forgetting, I apologize, but I think I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any other hands raised. So let's go ahead.
Kick off our questions.
Yeah.
Great. And it looks like we've got until 11 o'clock for questions and comments. So some of the items for consideration that I would love for commissioners to speak to have to do with impacts. As you can see, this large infrastructure has a number of impacts. It would be helpful to understand what are the priority impacts to you. Another one is just looking at visual impacts. We saw a lot of visualizations. How significant are those visual impacts? I see that there's impacts to views, there's impacts to neighborhoods. So I think if you can speak to that as well. And then on the bridge types themselves, understanding are any of the bridge types that were presented appropriate or less appropriate, I think, in this context? Are there any that you don't think should be pursued? And then also in terms of bridge type, we should be talking to, what are our expectations for the sizing, the height, bulk scale, character, and how do we want to be involved in assisting with bridge types moving forward in the process. So there's a lot there to unpack. So once again, I guess we'll just have to keep it to very high level, and we can follow up with any additional comments in our follow-up letter. So we're going to follow the same order for commissioner questions. So we'll start with Amalia.
I have two questions. One, and I'm sorry I didn't dive into this, so if this exists, I can look at it as an after effect, but I really appreciate the visualizations, but I didn't see any that were related to the visual impacts more in the industrial land side. The various routes go over quite a few properties. And anyway, I just was wondering if there had been some visualizations done as that. And then related, I was wondering, there's a long construction timeline for this. Is there intensive construction, and how was, so I have two related questions. One, how was freight routes impacted related to port operations and just port access related to some of the construction, again, kind of on the east side of this, these lines that you're showing on the map? There's going to be a lot of impact as current in the next couple of years related to the reconstruction of East Marginal Way, and then this would just kind of roll in that there would be additional construction impacts following that project completion. That project was awarded a RAISE grant, so just curious about that. It's a lot of impacts to the area, and tied to that is this is also, I didn't really see if climate resiliency or adaptation was considered. This is all kind of one of our very sensitive areas. I know there's been a lot of studies around the port properties down there and the properties, and just thinking about the constructability and durability of this, not only of storm surges and other things during construction, but then also post-construction. So if anyone could answer those two questions about freight and climate resiliency, appreciate that. And those are my only questions.
Jason, I'm wondering if you could start maybe with the freight question.
Yeah, this is Jason again. So we have been coordinating with SDOT on projects along East Marginal and West Marginal and other projects in the area. So we're aware of those, and we're looking for some kind of synergies and some efficiencies with our project and those projects. I can't speak to the specific freight effects. I would need to phone a friend on that one, but we can get back to you on specifics on that. And then I also heard a first question about key observation points east of the waterway. And we looked at key observation points based on the analysis of what's called a sensitive receiver. So things like a residential facility or a view corridor, such as the West Seattle Bridge. There are not key observation points identified or sensitive receivers in the Soto industrial area. Therefore, visualizations were not produced for that. And I'm wondering, I know Dirk's on, if Dirk can weigh in a little bit more on the freight, and then I'll turn it back to Sloan for the third question. Dirk, are you?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, I just wanted to, on the question of the freight that was asked, we have worked with the Port of Seattle extensively and with SDOT. But on the north alignment, the north crossing clearly would have a lot more impact on freight than the two alignments that run along the south side of the bridge. Specifically because of the terminals on Harbor Island and also the five-way intersection that's on the West Seattle side of the West Duwamish Waterway. where the North Crossing goes over that intersection, and it's where a lot of freight traffic occurs. On the topic of resilience, yeah, we do look into that item, storm surge and things like that. The bridge itself would be it's the type of infrastructure that wouldn't be affected as much as other, at the ground type infrastructure, but we do keep that in mind as a criteria.
And I'll just
that help
to what Dirk was saying on the resiliency front. We didn't include that information in this presentation, but it's something that we'd probably follow up on or point you to more resources. One of the issues that the resiliency scan covered, was just thinking about the Pigeon Point hillside stability. So that is factored into the early conceptual design, but will need to be refined going forward, since that is sort of a slide hazard zone. And I think that the finding was actually that, might actually be an opportunity to increase stability with construction. So, but there's, more detail that we could get into in a follow-up. And that we did cover sort of our overall programmatic approach in our briefing last year. So that was really more focused on how, how we were looking at these issues and considering them in the design that you're seeing today.
Okay. Anything else, Amalia? Okay. Benita.
Great, thanks. So I wanted to understand a little bit more about, well, one, the vegetation impacts at Pigeon Point. Is that essentially an impact during construction because you have to take out all these trees that then could be restored and replanted and revegetated, or are you actually, because of the proximity or location of where the route corridor would be, are we losing a vegetated open space area there?
Dirk.
Okay, I will. Yeah, hold on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Both the south edge and the preferred alternative, will change the look of Pigeon Point. Both, obviously, during construction, trees will be removed, but once the guideway is in place, the type of vegetation that would be replanted, as well as some of the grading that needs to be done to have the guideway come through here, will make it look different. Not sure what the revegetation will look like. Obviously, that's a design item we would need to get into with parks and others, but it will not look like it looks today.
Okay, thank you. And Dirk, a related question, or somewhat related question. In the four different bridge type options you've shown, obviously they have different span lengths. Would any of these options result in less maritime business impacts, or is the assumption that whichever bridge type you're selecting that it would be the same displacement?
Yeah, I think bridge type doesn't has an impact on that number. I think it will be similar, but the alignment would make a difference as has been shown on the plans. But I don't know if we really designed all the column locations, whether we could save one more property. It's hard to tell. It is a real puzzle, regardless of which alignment we're on. But it's hard, it's too early to tell whether you could save something.
Okay, thank you. And I'll just make one comment before I pass on. I appreciate the four bridge type alternatives that are being studied, that you're looking at different options here. It seems to me that steel continuous truss, while that was a really good option to consider in the Ballard area because of context and adjacencies, that it doesn't really fit in this location. That said, I think a really elegant engineering solution, if it's concrete, it should be the approach forward. So to me, the extra dosed and cable stayed, rose to the top as being really, I would say, architecturally interesting. The opportunity for bigger spans, lighter footprint, and as opposed to the segmental box girder. Thank you.
Great. And so we're passing it over to Matt.
Hi, thanks. On the alignment, from what I've seen today, it seems like the preferred alignment is a good option based on this information. I think being close to the not separating and creating distance between the existing West Seattle Bridge is beneficial. But I mostly wanted to comment on the bridge type. Based on the information I've seen today, and I'll just be really direct, I think the box truss is out. I'm sorry, the box girder. The box girder is just a bad option. And I'm a direct person, so I like getting to the point. It's kind of really problematic visually. I think it's unarticulated, it's bulky, it's heavy-handed. Aesthetically, it's really problematic. I also think the extra dosed is also problematic, in my opinion, because both the box girder and the extra dose have to land in the water. And I don't see why we would do that if there's an alternative. So in my opinion, I think the box girder and the extra dose should be removed from consideration if this is the information that we understand. I do feel strongly, maybe somewhat at variance with Vanita, that the steel box truss should be considered. I think it does have a good, there's a strong context for industrial areas of Seattle of using this type of construction, including the Bascule, the train bridge right next to it. And so I think it's articulated character. It has much lighter in feel. And then also just the engineering, the fact that it is lighter, and the discussion on the soils and the bearing capacity of the soils. So I would really like to see further analysis of both the steel continuous truss and the cable stayed options. And like I said, I'm confused why the other two options that land in the water are even being considered. And again, just to be clear, as the architect, I am interested in aesthetics. I'm interested in engineering as an expression. And I think the two concrete options are pretty poor, at least as presented today. Thank you.
Great, thank
Elaine,
you.
if I could just jump back in, and thank you for pointing out that the extra dose lands in the water. I actually missed that in all the content that we're absorbing. So I totally agree with Matt there about avoiding options that land in the water. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Elizabeth.
Thank you. This was a lot of information. I'm going to try and stay in my lane as an artist. I heartily agree with Matt about the steel option. I just came back from Portland, drove across a beautiful historic bridge on the north end of Portland that goes over Sauvie Island. I think I'm interested in these views and receivers of views, and for me, as someone who lives in urban spaces and other spaces, I think views of and views from need to be equally considered. This is a transportation question where people are going to be in moving objects, trains going, light rail, going from here to there. The people will see the bridge they're on. They'll see other elements, and these bridges are big objects. They will be seen from everywhere. almost everywhere in the city of Seattle when they're built. So I think treating these as beautiful objects. As an artist, I find functional infrastructure and functional in all the ways that Matt pointed out, lightness and of structure. I find that really beautiful. And so I think we need to be considering beauty for all citizens with these very large objects that do not land in the water, hopefully. So I have some questions about some of the aesthetic considerations. The other thing I would like to, I'm wondering about is, has the experience of the other crossing of the Duwamish that was affected by ST1, what lessons were learned by that, and how is that influencing these bridge types? So there is light rail already crossing over water from an earlier version of Sound Transit.
Yes, yeah, there is. On the initial segment, there's a crossing further south. I think that and I'm a little bit out of my lane here, but I think that's technically in the non-navigable section where there isn't the same clearance requirements. So it's a lot lower, but I don't know if Dirk or Kate can.
I can answer. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what the question was, but I mean, we do have a crossing in Tequila over the Duwamish. The length of that crossing is shorter. We're out of the water there. And it's a segmental box girder, but it's in a more rural environment, with different environment in here. But it's a shorter bridge, so it allows you to have a lighter segmental box girder. But it's currently the longest crossing in our bridge inventory.
Thank you. That's helpful. One of the things I know about ST1 is that artists from the Sound Transit Art Program were involved in some of the aesthetic decisions made for that alignment, that light rail segment. So I'm hoping that you might enlarge the design team to include artists, sculptors that are related to the art program, if at all possible, because I think that does help with looking at these pieces of infrastructure as something beautiful, as beautiful objects in our urban and rural landscapes. I'll pass it on to Pooja. Thank you.
I don't have any additional questions, but did also want to echo what Matt was saying about staying out of the water. I didn't notice that with the extra dosed option, and think that's incredibly important.
Great. Erica?
Hi, thanks. I would fourth Matt's options about the bridge staying out of the water, super critical in this location. I bike over the lower Spokane Bridge every morning and would love to see what the visual impacts are to the pedestrian and bicycle experience from that lower bridge as well. I didn't see any of those. And it is the folks coming to and from West Seattle have quite the industrial experience to get through before kind of getting back into the neighborhood. And when you bike over these bridges or walk over them, walking into Pigeon Point is like a moment of oasis. Like all of a sudden, you have dealt with miles of sort of a concrete jungle, and then you step back into what is a really beautiful community. And so to me, as an urban designer and just as a community member, the preservation of that experience of re-entering into what the Parks Department and, the Dirt Corp and all of these environmental groups have worked so hard to retain in that green belt and work to bring back to life is is really critical. And so in my mind, doing whatever we can to continue to preserve that green space is really important. This area has lend itself to the pressures of industrialization for hundreds of years. And I would like us to just take into account that there are people who live adjacent to these and have for many, many years. And so reducing the impacts of our further decisions on those folks. So I would love to see what the experience, sort of the visualizations are so important, and kind of what that experience is for the lower bridge folks. You know, thousands of people, over 100,000 people will return to driving over this bridge every day. And then hopefully we'll have thousands that view that incredible, you know, sight of Rainier as they come home and to work every day. And that is something that means a lot to the people in this community. And so doing as much as we can to preserve that view is really amazing. When I bike over the Spokane Street Bridge, I do it at dawn often, and people literally stop to line up on that bridge to watch the sunrise. And it seems like that could be taken away from those folks. And so it's something that I would love to make sure is analyzed in these different options. And I also agreed that I thought the steel continuous truss bridge was actually not a bad option. I think that anything that just doesn't create even more of a shadow or more of sort of like an impending object over the water is a nicer effect in this area, just to kind of lesser that impact. And I'll pass it to Jill.
Thanks. So back to this, or doubling down on this, no columns in water bad. I believe you said that the south edge crossing, all 4 of your types would inevitably end up in the water. And so I guess I'm wondering why that option is even viable. And looking at your summary chart, it has nothing that performs at the highest level. So what I'd like to ask for the future, because I know we're running out of time here, is if we could see the 4 bridge types for the north option. You've shown us the 4 bridge types for your preferred, and it's clear that we really only think 2 of them are viable, and that people have different aesthetic ideas about those 2. South Edge crossing doesn't seem like it's worthy of much more exploration. So if in the future there's some way that we could see, or you could ship to us or whatever, the bridge typologies for the north, I think that'd be a fantastic follow-up for us for this presentation. And so back to you, Elaine.
Great. I will try to keep this brief. I will also echo support for more study on the box girder, and then the cable stay options as being less impactful and offering the best opportunity for visual interest. I also think that, you know, once again, we should be looking for this large infrastructure piece to be something that can be celebrated, and not just, you know, not just getting from point A to point B. It's going to be incredibly impactful no matter which option we choose. And so how do we create something that at least is delightful for people to look at and for people to ride on? So I think for
Elaine,
me,
sorry to interrupt, but did you mean box girder or did you mean the steel continuous truss?
oh, I meant the steel continuous. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so I think, you know, visual impacts are very important to me. Also, view impacts. I think that the views to Mount Rainier and also back to Seattle are incredibly important, and how those, you know, how some of the, you know, these bridge options and then the continuation of it impact those views, I think is critical. I'm also very interested, I'd love to learn more about sustainability. And I know I keep bringing this up about carbon analysis, lowering our embodied carbon footprint. There's a huge amount of concrete being used on this alignment. And and I know there's a lot of projects, especially in the Northwest, that are really amping up how they're looking at concrete and lowering impacts on sustainability. So I'd love to see more information there. And then I also think it's interesting that I'd like to see more visualizations on the north alignment, as Jill said. I think it's interesting that we look at the impacts to the maritime industry, but we're not really showing like how the bridge really impacts that. I think it's interesting that the industrial area isn't considered sort of a sensitive area in terms of how things look. Because I just think that there's a ton of, I think the industrial areas are really beautiful in their own right. But, and I think I might just, I think I have more interest in understanding about the maritime businesses that are impacted, like the size of those businesses, and just wanting to learn a little bit more about that, because I think the north option may have some merit. So I'll just stop there because I know we're already like almost 15 minutes over our targeted time, and we'll continue on. Thank you.
Hi, Benita and everybody. Here's a suggestion. Well, it gives everyone an opportunity to just take a breath for a minute. It's been an amazing morning, but we've been going at lightning speed. I think that there's plenty of time to go through the presentation, but it will truncate or essentially eliminate any substantive question and comment period from the commissioners. I think that's fine. What we could do is understand that since we do have a hard stop at 12:30, any opportunity that we have for commission questions or comment we'll be able to do, but with the understanding that we have to stop right at 12:30. Any comments that the commissioners would send in after the fact, happy to share with you Sound Transit or the extent to which it's not duplicative in what we've been writing as a communication, which I've informed Sloan about today. We can leave it at that. So, Vanita, any thoughts on that?
I think that sounds fine. I would like to make sure commissioner comments get recorded. So let's make sure that everyone, if they don't have a chance to make comments or questions, that we then collect those.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. With that, I will mute and hand it over to Sloan.
Right. Thank you, Michael. So I think that we'll actually be able to, I can move through some of the station slides, and so as to try to economize and really, preserve as much time as possible for discussion at the end. I did put a pause in between the Dakota street alternatives and the others just to answer questions, but we could forego that if we prefer. So maybe what I'll do, I'm going to first ask Jason just to walk us through the alternatives, orient us to the alternatives in West Seattle, since there are a lot of interconnections between choices that we make in Delridge, Delridge Station, which we'll be looking at, and the alignments into Alaska Junction. Jason, are you still on the phone with us?
I'm here. Thanks, Sloan. Yeah, and I'll recognizing that we're a little bit behind, I'll be brief as well. Can we jump to slide 68, please?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So here we show two segments for the West Seattle Link extension. We show the Delridge segment on the right, and then we show the West Seattle Junction segment on the left. And while they're two distinct segments, we often look at these together because they're very interconnected, depending on whether we connect to an elevated or tunnel station in Avalon. We have a much different structure height in Delridge. which leads to different impacts for displacements and costs and things. And I think you'll see that as we walk through one at a time. I'm going to just briefly, at a high level, describe the alternatives in Delridge. The alternatives in Delridge include one station, which would be elevated. The guideway is elevated from about Southwest Charleston Street at the northeast, which is the top right corner. Again, north is up. You can see the Nucor steel plant kind of center right of the two vertical white lines at the top of the screen. We have different heights for each of the 3 different station locations. I'm just going to briefly describe the station locations. Toward the top, we have what we call the Andover Street station locations. This would be a station west of Delridge Way, north of Southwest Andover Street, just at the southeast corner of Nucor. We also have a station location over Delridge Way between Southwest Dakota Street and Southwest Andover Street. This would have station entrances on both sides of Delridge Way. And then finally, the pink line there represents what we call the Dakota Street station locations. This station would be south of Dakota Street between Delridge Way and 26th Avenue Southwest. The guideway would follow kind of 2 or 3 distinct paths through Delridge. Many of the alignments would follow Genesee, either on the south side of Genesee along the north edge of the West Seattle Golf Course, or we have some that would follow the north edge of Genesee to minimize the effect on the golf course. Just to the right of those white lines, you can see black brackets that represent the tunnel portals for our longer tunnels. And then we also have 2 corridors from those Andover Street stations. One would follow the Avalon Way right of way, so it would travel west along Andover, curving southwest along Avalon Way. That would connect to an elevated station at Avalon. And then we'd have another that would continue further west along the Yancey-Andover corridor. And then it would follow closely to the West Seattle Bridge approach to Fauntleroy and a retain cut station at Avalon. So the West Seattle Junction segment includes 2 stations, one at Avalon and one at Alaska Junction. Avalon and Alaska Junction both have options for elevated stations or tunnel stations with lower height and Delridge when connecting to those tunnel Avalon stations. And then we have a number of different station locations. Most are within the vicinity of Southwest Alaska between 41st and 42nd. You can see those 2 browns, the blue and the pink there on the left. And then we have the pink that's further east, which would include an elevated station over Alaska at Fauntleroy Way Southwest. And I know that Sloan's going to go through this in a little more detail. So before he does, I just want to go to the slide 69 and just note that we have a summary here, similar to what we saw for Duwamish. Again, on the left, we have some of the key differentiators, some of the key criteria from the draft EIS. At the top, we have 2 alternatives on each of these, and this is a connection showing the alternative in the West Seattle Junction above the connection for the alternative in Delridge. We have that performance key at the bottom right, and we have some upcoming slides that go through each one of these on their own, but we wanted to kind of provide this up front just to give you a sense of the number of different connections we have. The next slide, please. And here again, we have the 2 pink preferred and the 2 brown preferred with third-party funding, but we compare them to the Delridge Way Station and the Delridge Way Station lower height, comparing the connection to the elevated Fauntleroy or Tunnel 41st, just to note that the performance is similar for the Delridge Way Station alternatives than it is to the Dakota Street Station alternatives. Again, I'm not going to talk to this slide too much, but it's a good summary for future reference. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Colin.
Actually going to turn it back to me.
Oh, sorry, back to Sloan. I'm sorry. Thanks.
For now, but Colin, towards the latter part of our section of the presentation this morning, so we're going to jump into the Delridge Station alternatives. But first, Jason already provided you with an overview of the alignments and the station locations. The fact that we have 4 alternatives and 3 distinct locations that we're looking at in variations, different profile. But this is also getting to our outcomes and priorities for the station. This is a really important focus area for our racial equity toolkit work for reasons that we already heard about from Vera and Lucian earlier in the presentation. Given that this is going to be such an important bus to rail transfer site for routes that are serving the South Delridge corridor down to White Center and Burien, this is going to be a sort of a first point of access, fastest point of access for many in the south end of the West Seattle Peninsula and the Delridge corridor to the Link light rail system. So really ensuring excellent integration between bus and rail at the station to enhance the mobility and access for the communities of color that live in the southern reaches of the Delridge corridor. Really important priority, shared priority with ST, City of Seattle, and Metro. But also, as you heard and you'll see in more detail, thinking about the opportunities that these different station locations present for equitable transit-oriented development, and specifically addressing some of those priorities from the North Delridge Action Plan and other city plans that have identified issues such as expanding affordable housing access, food access, and sort of more spaces for gathering and for culture. So you'll see, as we've seen in our other plans, sort of areas identified for potential transit-oriented development, and you can sort of imagine that those spaces would provide some of those opportunities. So first, just a quick little overview, as we've done with our other presentations here. This is showing the Delridge Station area. The gray outline is the combined 10-minute walkshed of the different alternatives. I know that we've had some feedback from folks in our engagement efforts that this is a little misleading because obviously you have a unique walkshed associated with each station. And in areas like this in Delridge, where you have a lot of topography, that walkshed can look quite different. So as we're moving farther north, where you have more of those big infrastructure pieces, you have the hills and such, and the steel plant, the walkshed is a bit more constrained than as you're moving farther south, even towards Genesee with the Dakota street alternatives here. As noted, we were expecting close to 6,000 average daily boardings at the station. Nearly 90% of those folks will be accessing via bus, just underscoring that bus to rail transfer priority. And Vera also noted that this is not designated as an urban village. So you can see there's quite a range of zoning going from manufacturing, industrial, commercial to single family being a big share of the zoning, the current zoning within the station area. This slide is showing some of the themes that we've heard from our engagement so far. So during our alternatives development phase, where we were identifying routes and station locations to study in the draft EIS, as well as engagement that we did early in the draft EIS phase in 2019, just before the pandemic. And this feedback has really sort of helped to, along with the past planning documents and our racial equity toolkit work, to help shape how Sound Transit and our agency partners are evaluating the alternatives and evolving the design. So some of these points we've already heard a lot about in terms of including mixed-use development with access to food and groceries, really optimizing the transfer experience and the experience of light rail for communities connecting from the south. And also, of course, the strengthening and protecting of the Longfellow Creek watershed and really thinking about opportunities for celebrating that corridor and the places around it. So you can see here, quite a few of those destinations that we've been talking about this morning, from Southwest Youth and Family Services near the Community Center in Playfield, the Youngstown Cultural Arts Center, and the Delridge Community Center, and then Longfellow Creek and Dragonfly Garden and Pavilion, would all be quite close, especially to the Dakota and Delridge station locations, a little bit more distant from the but a lot of the things that we've heard about this morning really reflected in our engagement so far. So we're going to start by looking at the preferred alternative, which is the elevated Dakota Street Station. It's on a sort of diagonal orientation in an elevated configuration between essentially in neighborhood bounded by 26th Avenue Southwest, Southwest Dakota, Southwest Genesee, and Delridge Way Southwest. So you can see just to the south of the station location would be the Delridge Skate Park and Community Center block on the south side of Genesee Street. A little bit to the west across Longfellow Creek is the Dragonfly Garden and Pavilion. And then it would also be just south of the DSHS Community Services Office and the relatively recently developed Youngstown Flats. The Youngstown Cultural Arts Center is a little bit off to the lower right of the image here, with the hill climb staircase going up Genesee noted at the corner of Genesee and Delridge. So looking at this alternative, this is connecting or could connect to any of the Duwamish River crossing alternatives that we're looking at. This would connect to an elevated Avalon station and could connect to a short tunnel into the junction, but in most cases would be looking at connecting to one of the elevated alternatives in the junction. That elevated to Avalon connection results in a quite high station here. So the station platform itself would be 85 feet above grade from the cross-section sort of spot taken here from the essentially the north head house looking northeast. The top of the structure would be up to 110 feet above ground at this point. And as it's transitioning over Longfellow Creek, it would carry that sort of 110 foot, I think actually to the bottom of the guideway, which we'll see in the visual simulations here shortly. That height necessitates several mezzanine levels to provide safe access and egress from the station. You can see the blue is denoting the rough configuration of vertical circulation from ground to the different mezzanines, and then moving up to the platform. And this would contain the combination of escalators, stairs, and elevators. Looking at the transit integration scheme, this alternative calls for or contemplates a deviation of buses, the Rapid Ride H line, and that line that Lucien was talking about earlier from South Seattle College, from Delridge Way over to 25th Avenue Southwest, which is currently a very residential feeling street, but would need to be redesigned and engineered to support that sort of pattern of use. Getting to what Vera was talking about earlier about if this moves forward as preferred, really looking at the cross section and making sure that it's designed and programmed to accommodate those uses. And that would enable a essentially directly adjacent to the station entrance bus stop zone that would also be off of the arterial. And then it would, the buses would find their way again to Delridge Way Southwest via a likely dedicated bus pathway on Dakota Street and a transit and a new traffic signal and crosswalk that would need to be inserted at Dakota and Delridge to accommodate that pattern. The southbound buses and westbound buses would remain Delridge Way and would have a stop zone on Delridge. So you would essentially have stops that would be on either side of the block with direct access to the station entrance. The paratransit stop is called out here as being on Dakota Street, likely off of that dedicated transit pathway that we were referring to. I was just referring to. So walking and biking to the station, a few key things to point out. This obviously results in a major change to what's currently a residential neighborhood, and would involve quite a bit of sidewalk improvements around the station to facilitate access to it above and beyond what sort of the current standard is along those streets. It would really involve looking at 26th Avenue Southwest, which is currently a neighborhood greenway, sort of a narrow residential street, and really thinking about the sufficiency of that width and that cross section to accommodate those uses. So maybe looking at improving those facilities to either protected facilities or on street lanes. And then, looking also at new signals and new crossings around the station, including of 26th Avenue Southwest and potentially even of Genesee Street at 25th. But definitely at Dakota Street and Delridge, as well as potential for mid-block crossings that would essentially stitch Nevada Street to Delridge Way through this site. With this particular station alternative and the lower height version that we'll walk through shortly, there is a substantial opportunity, probably the largest opportunity for equitable TOD owing to the footprint of the project as it's moving through this neighborhood. That would present about 400 homes or housing units that could be developed, assuming of potential future rezone action by the city, and up to 34,000 or maybe even more square feet of commercial, which could be retail or other sort of active ground floor uses like social services and daycares and the like. And I think we covered this in our programmatic briefing on TOD late last year. But Sound Transit's equitable transit-oriented development policy prioritizes affordable housing and community-oriented retail and services in developments that happen on property that is acquired for construction and operation of stations and other facilities. So we would expect that this would be predominantly affordable housing or mixed income housing that would be developed in association with this. And also pointing out a couple of places along the guideway as the guideway is approaching the station, specifically at the DSHS Community Services Office, and then as it's moving away from the station towards Avalon near Longfellow Creek, a couple of areas where there would be property that would have to be acquired for the guideway, and that could present some opportunity for creative public spaces or open spaces in parkland developed underneath the guideway. So those are sort of some of the key points around enjoying places around the station and TOD opportunities. To give you a sense of the structure heights, I was sort of alluding to it in the station overview, but given that elevated Avalon and connection into the junction, the Delridge Station top of structure would be at 110 feet, so 85 feet from ground to the platform, 110 feet when you include the canopy and the parapets for vertical circulation, et cetera. And then at the lowest point, at the crossing of Longfellow Creek, it would be 150 feet high on the guideway connecting to the Avalon Station. And in terms of the different structure types, the Appendix J that Jason was speaking to earlier contains the current sort of detailed plans that show the different column types and locations associated with the alternatives. This just sort of summarizes, as we're moving through the Delridge Valley, the essential type of structures we could expect to see, with use of straddle bents, particularly around the station, as well as in the transition from the Pigeon Point guideway to the station at the north end. That's the sort of the currently contemplated structure type, just to make sure that it's clearing the Del Ridge right-of-way and other structures and uses in the north end of the corridor. And then as we transition from the center platform station at Del Ridge, the structure type would shift to center loaded columns all the way until it reaches the next station. Since most of our stations are assuming center platform, which are sort of our operational standard choice, in most cases at stations, we would be looking at transitioning to straddle bent structures. So now we're going to look at some similar visual simulations of the guideway and the approach to the stations for the preferred alternative at Dakota. This is the existing condition looking north along Del Ridge Way southwest at about Genesee Street, a little bit north of Genesee Street. So you can see the Queen Anne Hillside and the Youngstown residential neighborhood in this image. This is the guideway structure, so you can see the transition from Pigeon Point. Again, on those straddle bent structures over Del Ridge Way, transitioning to the station, you can see the very north end of the station in this image. That's the elevator core. And this is what that sort of looks like if connected to a north of West Seattle Bridge Duwamish crossing alternative. So quickly page back and forth. Slight variation in height and bulk owing to that. This is our viewpoint looking northwest from the Del Ridge playfield. So imagine you're sort of standing right in front of the current Del Ridge Community Center, looking up towards Avalon Way and the Ridgeline. This is the Dakota Street Station alternative connecting the south crossing options. So right about here would be the Longfellow Creek crossing to the left of the tree. And I think it's at that point it's the same as the north crossing there. This is the view looking up Genesee Street. So just right by 26th Avenue Southwest, looking up towards Avalon Way. The West Seattle Golf Course is on the left side of the image, and residential units are on the right, with Longfellow Creek in the foreground. This is the preferred Dakota Street Station alternative. So this would have columns landing on what's currently part of the right-of-way, entail an adjustment of the right-of-way up towards Avalon Way. And the golf course, you could see it would entail modification and removal of trees on the north end of the golf course. And this is the connection to the north, what we call the north alignment alternative, which is the alternative that avoids the golf course impacts on the north end of the golf course. So you can see straddle bent structure type, and then columns supporting the guideway as it's transitioning towards Avalon Way on the north side of Genesee Street. Does entail a revision of Genesee Street based on the current structure design. This is looking past the north end of the West Seattle Golf Course towards downtown. So we're in the golf course right now, looking towards downtown, sort of northeast. This is the preferred alternative, sort of as it's on the north end of the golf course, with the 150-foot span over Longfellow Creek, just on the right side of this image. And this is that north, that north of Genesee Street alignment. So again, sort of handing back and forth. The big difference here is that in order to avoid the golf course with that north Genesee option, you would end up having to take residential units to site the guideway columns. And this is looking east along Southwest Genesee Street from the top of the hill at Avalon back towards Delridge Way. The golf course is on the right of this image, and the residential units on the left here on the north side of Genesee Street. So this is the baseline preferred alternative, and this is the north side of Genesee Street alternative. And Delridge Station is, see sort of here, this is the south elevator column, elevator tower. So I won't, in the interest of time, I won't spend a lot of time covering these. This is just the sort of the DEIS summary of this pink preferred alignment alternative serving the Dakota Street Station connecting to elevated Avalon and elevated Alaska Junction Station at 41st, 42nd Avenue Southwest. The different column structure heights are called out here in some of the considerations with impacts to parking and access of the DSHS facility right near the Dakota Street Station alternative, about 0.5 acres of park impacts unless the alignment is moved to north side of Genesee Street, and of course the taller guideway and station being some of the key distinguishing features of this alternative. And then there's also a version of this that connects to an Alaska Junction station at Fauntleroy. The impacts in the Delridge area are much the same as with what we were just looking at with the farther west Alaska Junction alternative. And you can see the cost of that farther west elevated alternative are $400 million more than this alternative. So that's the preferred alternative that was identified in May 2019 by the Sound Transit Board, moving out of the alternatives development process. Board resolution also identified, as with Ballard, identified what we called preferred alternative with third-party funding. And that essentially meant tunnel alignments into the junction that then could connect to a lower height guideway and station in Delridge. The location aspects of the station are very similar to what we were just looking at, the layout and configuration. A few key differences to point out here. This alternative assumes that there would need to be a closure, likely a full closure of 25th Avenue Southwest. Of course, is design, if this moves forward and this design is refined for column placement, et cetera, we might be able to keep that street open. But to capture a range of impacts associated with different alternatives, this assumes closure of that street, or at least it not being a full through street between Genesee and Dakota. And that results in a slightly longer deviation for buses, which we'll cover in more detail here shortly. Also more traffic on 26th Avenue Southwest. So really elevating the need to look at the cross-section and maybe expanding the cross-section of that street. But the entrance locations on that corner of Delridge and Dakota, as well as 26th and Nevada, are very similar. Slight differences in configuration because this is a lower height station and doesn't require as much in the way of mezzanines. And you can see that here in our cross-section, which is taken from the north end of the platform and in the north station entrance. The station platform height would be 35 feet above grade at this point, so 50 feet lower than the alternative connecting to elevated Avalon. And the top of the structure height, so when you include canopies, et cetera, would be about 60 feet. So it would be sort of at the level of a typical sort of 5/1 construction type, maybe even a bit lower with this alternative. As I was alluding to, circulation here for buses is a little bit, requires a bit of a longer deviation for northbound buses on Delridge Way. So they would turn left at Genesee Street versus going onto 25th, as with the higher height, the higher version of this. They would go to 26th Avenue, turn right, and essentially access a bus stop zone on Dakota Street before transitioning north along Delridge Way via a new signal and crossing. So that would result in the sort of consolidated bus zone on the block face of Dakota Street, as well as on the block face of Delridge Way. And so you would still end up with pretty close proximity to that North Station entrance, which we would imagine would be used more for bus to rail transfers, and the South Station entrance being a little bit more oriented towards the neighborhood and some of the surrounding destinations at the cultural center and the community center in Longfellow Creek. You can also see here the paratransit would have to be shifted to 26th Avenue Southwest, pickup drop-off, probably shifted. We've talked about other locations for this alternative too. But so quite a few uses on 26th Avenue Southwest that would need to be carefully thought about, including bike trails. And this is just calling out many of those considerations with the taller Dakota alternative. Here, the opportunity for equitable TOD is the same, pretty much the same as with the taller Dakota Street alternative. Similar opportunities for creative public spaces under tracks and the approach to the station and the move away from the station, sort of north and south of it, of course, with a lower height guideway than the taller structures with the other alternative. And with mid-block crossings and the potential to, with that partial street or partial street closure, to really think about sort of a plaza or public space that could really foster gathering and be activated by some of the adjacent TOD, potential TOD developments that could be sort of a space for community to gather right adjacent to the station. So this is looking at the alignment or corridor level with that lower height alternative. You can see the elevated section transitions right around 31st Avenue Southwest to an at-grade sort of embankment before entering a tunnel portal. And that serves a tunnel, Avalon Station, and tunnel Alaska Junction Station, which you can see here in the profile. And similarly, we would expect straddle bents to be used in the transition from Pigeon Point to the station, and then transition to columns as the guideway is moving past the station before entering the tunnel portal. So we're going to look at those same views that we saw with the higher alternative here. So this is looking north along Delridge Way Southwest. This is that lower height structure, moving to the station. This is looking northwest from Delridge Playfield. So a lot lower here. And looking west along Southwest Genesee toward Avalon with Longfellow Creek in the foreground. So you can see the guideway transitioning at this point to single columns before entering the tunnel portal and structural berm essentially facilitating that transition. So the tunnel portal would be into the hillside right below apartment buildings at the Southwest Avalon grade. golf courses here on the left. And a feature here to point out, it would be with this lower height alternative would be a need for netting, sort of taller sort of net sort of structure to prevent errant golf balls from hitting the trains as they're transitioning into the portal. This is the avoidance alternative of the golf course impact. So more straddle vents to help the guideway sort of snake around to the tunnel portal, which is obscured by the two tubs here in this image, but you can see the sort of clear span over Southwest Genesee Street. And then this is looking past the north end of the West Seattle Golf Course towards downtown. So the lower height transitioning to the tunnel portal, which is just off of this image, and those new nets that would need to be protecting the light rail vehicles. And this is the north of Genesee alignment alternative. And our final viewpoint here looking east along Southwest Genesee toward Delridge from Southwest Avalon. Again, see the station would be sort of obscured by the trees here, but it would be right behind these trees, and then transitioning to the portal right below Avalon Way. And this is the north end of Genesee Street alternative, avoiding the golf course. So again, comparison. Okay, so summarizing what the DIS found with this alternative, this has, if we are not on that north of Genesee alignment, would have 1.4 acres of impacts to the West Seattle Golf Course between essentially the tunnel portal site and 26th Avenue Southwest. It would, of course, though, be a lower guideway and station, a lot lower at Delridge Station, and sort of similar impacts to the social service provider DSHS to their parking facility as the guideway is transitioning through the Delridge Valley. This is actually for the Tunnel 41st and Alaska Junction. This is just another alternative in the junction that would be under 42nd Avenue Southwest. The impacts would be very similar in the Delridge corridor. So there was a lot of information. Wanted to just sort of pause really fast to see if there's an interest in asking questions, or if you'd like me to continue going through the alternatives, the remaining two alternatives we have.
Makes sense to do the other alternatives now.
Yeah, I think you should keep going through, Sloan.
Okay, all right, very good. Okay, so now we're going to move from, we're starting with the Dakota alternative, so that was sort of the farthest south, closest to the Youngstown Cultural Arts Center, Delridge Community Center, and other destinations. Now we're moving a little bit further to the north for the other draft EIS alternative at Delridge Way. This, again, would be an elevated station over Delridge Way with entrances on either side of it, and would connect to a number of elevated options into the junction or tunnel, and also the different crossings that we were looking at earlier. The context, this would be essentially right next to the DSHS and community services buildings, as well as the Bartell commercial building on the corner of Andover and Delridge. Would then have a guideway that would be transitioning over the residential neighborhood in Youngstown, just to the south. This provides a view, sort of a cross-section of this alternative. So you can see the entrances on either side of Delridge Way with vertical circulation up to a shared mezzanine that would allow passengers to walk essentially to vertical circulation right to platform. And top of the platform height would be about 65 feet above grade, and the top of structure would be 90 feet, factoring in the vertical circulation towers and parapets. I'll just note that this configuration is showing, so there's sort of two within the draft EIS, two versions of this, two different profiles. This is the alternative that, or the profile that connects to the elevated Avalon station at Genesee, which is the elevated alternative that we were looking at, connected to the elevated Dakota street alternatives. So that would connect also to this one. So that's what results in 65-foot platform height up to 90 feet top of structure. It could connect to tunnel alignments into Alaska Junction as well, which could bring the platform height slightly lower by about 10 feet. So that would just result in slightly lower structure heights as noted on this cross section. Transit integration is very straightforward with this alternative, requires no deviation for buses, as we saw in the cross section. Bus stops would be essentially right outside of the station entrances, so you would just get off the bus and you would hop into one of the two station entrances, circulate up and then over to get to the platform. So operationally, this is sort of the most straightforward for transit service. And that would allow Dakota Street to be sort of focused on pickup, drop-off, and paratransit uses. On walking and biking, this would really, the structure here would have a lot of big footprint on Delridge Way, so it would really entail sort of expanding the right-of-way here to ensure that there's adequate walking and biking facilities, sidewalks, et cetera, under the structure at this point. Also because the hill, the topography transitions very quickly to the east, essentially after that first row of parcels on Delridge Way. There would be a potential to look at a hill climb that could connect the Delridge Way grade up to 23rd Avenue Southwest, which currently is a planned greenway that would link points farther south here. I'll note that with this alternative, we don't have sort of a critical mass of property available for subsequent redevelopment. So this is sort of a differentiator for this alternative. Very straightforward transit integration, but not as much opportunity for equitable TOD after construction. But we do think that with the footprint of the project, that there might be opportunities for creative public spaces under the tracks as the guideway is transitioning from the station location. And of course, plazas around the station entrances would provide some opportunities for gathering and activation. So this is just summarizing the structure heights with that higher version of this connected to the elevated Avalon station. Very similar structure profile over Longfellow Creek at about 150 feet. But the longer run of guideway allows for a little bit more time, essentially, for the guideway to transition to a lower structure height at Delridge Station with this alternative. And you saw on the station context plan a lot of straddle vents that would be essentially on both the north and the south end of the station on Delridge Way. So it would really, you'll see here with the visual simulation, sort of change the feel of that. So we're going to look at first that north perspective along Delridge Way. You can see the station and the straddle vent structures over Delridge that would sort of, leave this sort of rib cage effect with this. And then looking northwest from Delridge Playfield, pretty similar to the Dakota alternative. This is the lower height version of that would connect to the tunnel alternatives into the junction. So by this point, it sort of looks more like our like the Dakota preferred with third-party funding alternative. Very similar sort of look and feel coming up Genesee Street with this as with the Dakota alternative and with the tunnel alternative. And likewise, similar for the view from the golf course to the north for both the higher height and the lower height tunnel connection. And similarly here. Tunnel, an elevated connection. So with this alternative, a few things to note in the Delridge segment. This would involve, of course, putting the station entrance right on the DSHS property. So it would have some impacts on their operations and their parking lot, though it would not physically impact the building. This alternative does likely involve more of an impact on Fire Station 36. And still has impacts unless that north side of Genesee avoidance alternative were pursued on the golf course. So similar story as the Dakota alternatives with the Fire Station 36 sort of being a big differentiator here. And then if connected to a tunnel, have a little bit more golf course impacts as well for the tunnel portal. So finally, we have alternatives in at the north end of the corridor at Andover Street in Delridge. This alternative is a little bit farther to the west than what was in the representative alignment project that was in the ballot initiative in 2016, but would be entirely north of Andover Street. Some of the recencies to point out: some new core plant, the on-ramp and the West Seattle Bridge structure itself would be in the north end of the site with the new core parking and freight rail access separating the station site from the West Seattle Bridge. This is looking at the platform. Again, similar to the Delridge Way alternatives, we have a taller and a shorter version of this. This cross-section is actually looking at the shorter version, which would connect to a retained cut Avalon station and a tunnel station in the junction. This would be similar to the higher Delridge Way station alternative that we're looking at, so about 65 feet above the Charlestown Street grade at this point and 90 feet top of structure. It is important to note that there is quite a bit of grade change on the site between Charlestown Street and Delridge Way, so that might have sort of an offsetting effect of about 10 to 15 feet of perceived height from Delridge Way. There would be two entrances proposed with this, the south entrance being probably the most heavily used. And again, escalator, elevator, stairs that would connect to a mezzanine and then up to the platform as depicted on the cross-section on the left. Transit integration is a little bit tricky here because we are really close to that approach to the West Seattle Bridge, which really changes the operational character and the design character of Delridge Way Southwest. So in our work with Metro and the city so far, we've identified a deviation pathway for rapid ride in both directions on Andover Street and 26th Avenue Southwest, and ultimately over back to Delridge on Dakota Street to get bus riders transferring off of that sort of busy street condition for that very heavily used rapid ride. But it is probably the longest transfer so far. So if this alternative were to be identified as preferred moving into the final EIS, we acknowledge there's more thinking and design work to do to refine this alternative to perform higher. But there would also be some bus stops that would remain on Delridge, and that would mostly just be for the successor to the current Route 50, which would be also intercepting the light rail system at Alaska Junction and Avalon. So hence Metro's sense that perhaps it could remain on Delridge Way without deviating, and not be as big of an integration or transfer point between bus and rail here at Delridge. This is showing the walking and biking scheme. So the connection to the West Seattle Bridge is noted here. This is common to all the alternatives, that there would be sort of stitch into the West Seattle bike network, using the West Seattle Bridge, Andover Street, and 26th Avenue Southwest sort of Greenway. But this alternative, sort of all those things come together near this site. So really thinking about improvements to bicycle facilities on 26 and Andover to make that connection a little bit more legible to the bridge on the north side of Andover, and improvements to sidewalks and public realm noted here as well. And then there is opportunity for TOD associated with this alternative. It's different. It's quite a bit different character perhaps than what we're looking at with the Dakota alternatives. Currently the site is zoned commercial and industrial, so it could accommodate up to 700,000 square feet of commercial, in the footprints noted, or if there were to be some consideration of mixed uses and zoning, up to 160 homes and 260,000 square feet of commercial, which could include retail, it could include some office, or even some sort of more industrial sort of making uses. So that's a quick overview. I'm going to sort of skip past this so we can get into the comment. Hopefully you had an opportunity to review these slides before we got into the meeting today. I'm going to ask Colin to walk us through some of the key considerations and differentiators.
Good thing. Thanks, Sloan. Just really briefly, as with all of these design commission briefings, we try to condense a whole bunch of considerations down to just a few. But in Delridge, it's really three categories of key differentiator: the residential displacements, structure height, and bus rail integration. And Sound Transit folks, I apologize if I got any of these numbers wrong. I got them out of the DEIS, but if I'm looking at the wrong part, then forgive me and please correct me. So as far as residential displacements, the Andover alternatives have somewhat fewer residential displacements than the Dakota or the Delridge alternatives. In terms of structure height, the station heights are similar, around 100 feet, but then the guideway height after the Delridge station, before the Andover the Avalon station, is a little bit higher over Genesee Street than it is over 28th or Avalon Way, the New Core Steel area. And then as far as bus rail integration, the Dakota Street and Andover Street alternatives do require service deviations to 25th or 26th Avenue Southwest. The Delridge Way alternatives do not require deviation of the bus service. So in a really distilled down way, those three considerations are what are driving the city's discussion of a preferred alternative. Thanks.
Thanks, Colin.
And this is still me, huh? Okay, so what's our process? Through the comment period, we will, well, so first of all, we continue to engage community on the impacts of mitigation and develop a position on a preferred alternative. At the end of this month, we'll be transmitting our comments on the DEIS. And then in the months following, we'll work with our board members, Mayor Harrell, Council President Juarez. They'll present a position on a preferred alternative to the Sound Transit Board in June. And then next year, we will continue on until the FEIS. Thanks, Lon.
Thank you, Colin. All right. Lots of information. Sorry, we've been so pressed for time today. It's been we've had some challenges with technical difficulties at start. So thank you for bearing with us on this. Over to you, Vanita, and Elaine. Actually, I think Elaine's going to kick us off, right?
Michael, was there something that you wanted to add? I saw you popped on. Okay, great. So we'll move into questions and comments. And so obviously we're going to consolidate for the various stations. And I did put a new order for commissioner participation in the chat. And so, once again, we've got abbreviated time to offer comments, but some things to think about are, is there a preferred alternative and why? Alternatives that best serve the underserved community in terms of transit, housing, community development, just general connectivity is important. Speaking to what are the most impactful parts of some of these stations, including guideways, the infrastructure, the station design, etc. And then, just speaking to general expectations for sizing, height, bulk, scale, and character, and any other items you might want to consider today. Thank you. And we'll start with Jill.
Thanks, Elaine. I'm going to try to keep this really high level because we don't have much time. And it seems to me that this is the perfect example of where equity permeates through many, many, many layers. And I think the one that we haven't talked about, but most affects things, is whether there's going to be an investment in a tunnel to keep from bifurcating through these neighborhoods. And we can't know that right now, but I think so much of what happens at this Duwamish location is dependent on that. Keeping that in mind, the tunnel impact, I also agree that the transfer connections and then the equitable TOD and the community building are also hugely important. And I think what my first reaction is to looking at this is that the preferred alternative at 100 and some feet just doesn't cut it. That exact same footprint at the lower height coming out of a tunnel that we don't know is going to be there makes sense. But the height and the scale is so oppressive that it undoes any benefits that I could possibly see to that preferred alternative. So I think that the tunnel is hugely important because I think the height and the scale is just a big problem. And it's where it is a big problem is in the community building, in the community development. We talk about this isn't an urban village yet. We talk about the opportunity for the equitable development around it that could help build that urban village. But I think when you chop through it with that huge oppressive structure and that station that has no connection to the ground plane, that you're undoing everything you're trying to do. So I certainly appreciate what you've shown us. I think if the tunnel occurs, then there's a deeper dive for us about which of those two stations, either the diagonal one or the one that just straightens up and points north-south a block over, which one of those is the right thing for what I think is going to be the heart of this community and is right now. And if the tunnel doesn't occur, then I think we've got to do more work on the further north locations, which it seems counterintuitive to pull it out of where the heart of the community and the neighborhood would be. But I think that looking at that one, Sloan, you talked about how you can still make all the transit connections. Then I think you look at that as to how to have that at least not be eating at the fiber of the net of the community, and how you look to connect that in an equitable way. So that's just my first reaction. And then the other one is that straddle bents are sort of horrible. And every time I see one, I just have to decide that that's going to be some fabulous, huge art project, iconic thing that's going to make this okay. So that's from me, Elaine. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Erica.
Yeah, I'm gonna kind of start at I'm gonna try to be brief. Start at the minimal thing and work up. First and foremost, I think that being very careful about the plans for Genesee when you think about these alternative critical, there's very, very few east-west connections in this community, and Genesee actually provides one of the very few. And so if there's a huge construction project that impacts Genesee for an extended period of time, you're further disconnecting this community from all of their resources, which are at the top of Avalon. And so any time of those folks not being able to get up that hill is really problematic. I wanted to second what Jill was saying about the straddle bends. I mean, they already kind of destroy the pedestrian environment or just the physical environment of the area just immediately north. And so not allowing that sort of environment to further extend south makes, in my mind, the elevated Delaware station as it's presented just not a reasonable option. It just seems to completely kind of destroy the experience of Delridge Way. Whereas I actually, from a urban design standpoint, lean towards the Andover alternative because I think it offers the opportunity to create a true transit hub that could actually allow for folks to transition from bus and bike and ped into a shared building that would allow them to move comfortably into a train and not have to disrupt the portion of that neighborhood that is functioning well and would instead impact the area that doesn't serve the neighborhood as much today. And so I also think the existence of commercial TOD, as mentioned by the neighborhood planning earlier, is so critical to this community, making sure that there is space for grocery stores, for pharmacy, for all those needs that the community has stated for a very long time that they need, I think is actually more allowable if you have a footprint that utilizes the existing commercial TOD, which at this point doesn't serve the community in its greatest capacity. And so I guess I hope that there is more commercial opportunity within the stations themselves, and that the concerns of Genesee are really taken into account. And I'll pass it to Elizabeth.
Before Elizabeth gets started, Sound Transit, would you mind putting up a slide that shows the comprehensive options on the alternatives? Thank you. And Elizabeth, please take it away. Elizabeth, I don't see you responding. I think you're up next. Okay. Well, while we wait for Elizabeth, why don't we move on to Matt and we can round back with her when she's back.
Hi, I think what I can offer right now is probably similar to my comments about the Duwamish crossing. I guess I feel that this kind of public infrastructure is an opportunity to elevate the engineering and the presence of the engineering in the physical environment. And so you know, I'm concerned about the straddle bends and concerned about just the supports in general and the design of them. And I would be interested to see what other options there are for an engineering design that is more purposeful aesthetically. And you know, the guide, just speaking, you know, about the straddle bends, for example, the horizontals seem to, you know, they extend beyond the posts or the columns in a way that I wonder what that's about. Is that because of post tensioning or something? But is there some other option? Is there a steel girder option for the horizontals? How else can the elements be designed thoughtfully with an idea of their visual and spatial impact? And maybe that's to come later, but I think I'll just leave it there and let others comment. Thank you.
Great. We will move on to Pooja.
I was just wondering about, all the renderings that are shown have a lot of utility congestion with overhead power and overhead communication lines. I'm wondering how you're accounting for those utility relocations or undergrounding those utilities and even the below grade utilities in your pricing. I know it's early, but I would like to understand how that's worked into it.
So right now, I believe, Pooja, that there's no specific like there's assumptions that we have from a design perspective right now on do utilities get restored or are they undergrounded. Our cost estimates are pretty high level, so I think they're designed to accommodate a range of possibilities. So there's a lot of sort of gross up factoring, if you will, to account for that uncertainty. And I don't think that Dirk is on the meeting anymore, so I'm not sure that he is.
I'm here, Sloan.
Oh, you are, Dirk. Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Well, I just wanted to add that, Sound Transit is working very closely with SDOT and the various departments in the city, whether it's sewer, whether it's SCL, and we're looking at a lot of these issues, and whether that's undergrounding or doing some different routing, whether that's utilities in the ground or overhead utilities. There's just a lot of that going on, but because we still have multiple alignments, there's only so much we can do at this stage, but clearly it's part of the design process.
And I guess one of the reasons I'm asking is because there have been projects in the past where those costs have been passed on to the utilities rather than being included in the project costs. So I wanted to understand how and if those costs are going to be included in the overall cost of the light rail project.
Yeah, well, right now they are just as Sloan is saying, utilities have an allowance in the current cost estimate. How down the road those things how they shake out depends on what the designs are. So it's too early to comment on that now, but they are in the current cost estimate.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Pooja, for asking that question. I have the same concerns about the true cost being included regardless of who's taking it on. But from what I was seeing, these are full right-of-way roadway reconstruction projects that have probably significant impacts to the adjacent right-of-way to get these facilities that we're talking about, rapid ride bus stops, multimodal access, transit facilities, space for all those things. And it's just not clear to me like what those are, where those costs are factored into these. And I know we're talking billions of dollars, but I think that is very closely also tied to the community and the impacts of like how they're going to have to live during construction of this. And I feel like there's still a disconnect for me about the construction impacts of these alternatives. I also want to second all of the things that Jill said around the scale and again the impacts of that on the community, and again, just like we are fundamentally changing streetscapes and fundamentally changing the character of this. This is it will be very challenging to retain some community factors with the scale of what we're talking about here, and the impacts of construction for the duration of this that are I don't feel are fully realized, at least in the conversations right now. And the other thing that is on, so my question, the question I have is, I don't feel like I have a good grasp on if the residential displacement or some of the displacement factors include the guideway construction, or is it just in the parcels that you've highlighted? It seems like in the graphics you're showing, the perspectives and the plan view maps, that the guideways are on a lot of parcels or directly adjacent to parcels. And I'm not sure that those, it's unclear to me if those buildings are part of that displacement factor. From what I can see, it feels like it would be more than what the numbers you have listed.
So the great questions and comments. I'm going to start with the cost aspect. The cost estimates do assume, as Dirk was saying, with the utilities, but also with any street segments that would be directly impacted by the project. So including that section of 26th Avenue, or 25th or Dakota, whichever it would require the transit, the bus deviations from Delridge Way and the Delridge Way frontage itself would be part of the current cost estimate. So those are accounted for. But once it sort of exits the immediate sort of area of potential effect, any sort of additional investments or improvements or continuing facilities, might not necessarily be accounted for. So that would be an area where part of our co-planning with the city, sort of identifying where those interface zones might be, and then really allowing future projects by the city or by others to, make sure that those facilities are continued and appropriately, the extents are appropriate, essentially. On all of these impacts, there's actually, in addition to the draft EIS itself, there are presentations that we created for the last couple of community advisory groups, and I'll drop links to this in the chat. But those include visualizations or maps, diagrams showing construction impacts, road closures, and durations from the last couple of actually the last community advisory group. I think it was in March. So I will just going to copy that link in, and quite a few comments, I think, in our in the discussion so far touched on this. So you want to take a look at that to help inform your deliberation on that.
Thank you. And I think for the street, for me, the street impacts are really about where the guideways are located, and some of the graphics you showed about like true reconfiguration of the roadways for like Genesee, for example. And
Right.
that's a long segment, full reconstruction with some pretty significant right-of-way challenges on either side. That's a lot. It's going to be a lot and that's a key east-west connection for that community that will potentially be closed off for quite a while.
Right, and I'll note that probably where those impacts are the greatest on Genesee Street are for alternatives where we're avoiding the golf course. I mean, just to be very blunt about it. I mean, it's all golf course. That's the driver there. And in terms of the with those options, in terms of displacements, the totals that are on the summary slides that we were walking through account for everything. So it's not just sort of parcels in the station areas, it's the whole alignment segment. So okay. It's accounting for everything. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
No other questions.
Sloan, I'm just going to ask one question since we're near time. Can you flip to the next slide where there's the summary table?
Sure.
And essentially, I'm just curious that, in this table where what you're showing as the highest performing option is medium tunnel 41st Andover Street, lower height, has least amount of residential displacements, no park effects, among the lower end of the business displacements, and cost similar to the preferred alternative. So I guess, is the preferred, I mean, is that one, from Sound Transit's point of view, rising to the top, even though it wasn't identified as the preferred alternative in the DEIS?
Sure. So it's always useful, like what we always like to say with, the alternatives development process was, operating under, a certain level of information, that has evolved over time as we've looked at these alternatives further, applied more design effort, really understood the constraints more. So, that's sort of why, as we're moving from draft EIS to final EIS, we expect that we have this milestone confirm or modify the preferred alternative. And the preferred alternative may change. The board may identify a different alternative that moves forward as preferred to final environmental review and refine design. So it's not a statement of preference. We're not saying that this should be the preferred. We're not making a subjective judgment. We're just reporting the facts as we found them. And the categories of higher performing or lower performing are just their relative scores. So if lower residential displacements, it's higher performing in that category compared to the other alternatives. And with cost, if it's lower, then it's higher performing, et cetera. So we're just highlighting the fact that based on our current design assumptions, along cost, displacements, business and residential, and park effects, that this has lower impacts than the preferred or preferred with third-party funding alternatives.
Okay, thank you. We're really at time, so I guess I'll pass to Elaine, though. I think there were good comments made about, obviously, straddle bends are terrible, so if there's a way to minimize that, I think we definitely want to see that. And equity is a big issue in this segment. But I will stop there. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, and I don't know if Elizabeth was able to join us, so we might need to capture her comments later. I think just to summarize, for myself, I think I'll most closely align myself with Jill's comments. Very curious about the tunnel options, and do think that there's the very tall options at 100+ feet seem very sort of inhumane from a scale standpoint. I'm more interested in the ones that are closer to the ground, but then looking for opportunities that we can sort of have a lighter footprint on the communities, as we were talking about with the bridge as well. So I think with that, I'm just gonna end. I see Michael popping on, and probably time.
My job is to be the timekeeper, force of habit. We are right a couple of minutes after 12:30, but certainly worth the extra time. I think we could probably spend another hour here. So, with that, that's somewhat concludes the initial thinking about what these initial set of briefings on what was disclosed in the draft EIS. Just in sum, Sloan, I know I've said this before, but I'm going to say it again. This is one of the best sets of presentations I've seen in my tenure with the commission. I think you have done an exemplary job in helping to not only explain a complicated project, but enrich the conversation in ways that I think this project is better for. So thank you and your team. Benita, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to say.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much to digest here, and I really appreciate, first off, the collaborating on the presentation with the city. It makes all the difference. And all the details that were presented, the tables that weigh the factors for us. And yeah, we could go on and talk about this project for another hour, but I'm not going to do that. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for that feedback and for the opportunity to present you with all this information. It's a great team. We have a great team at ST and at the city, and so it's it's a lot of fun and a lot of something else too, but it's been great to be able to really dive into these with you and hear your feedback and on all these segments. And yes, Michael, I saw your email earlier, and I shared that with Kate and others. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Great. And then finally, we forgot to extend a little love to Vera and the city team. So Vera, city team, you're an equal partner in the success of these presentations, so thank you. Commissioners, why don't we live it up and say 1:15 as opposed to 1 o'clock? Just building on an earlier email chain, I think we all need to hydrate. So we'll take a little bit of extra time and we'll just see commissioners at 1:15 for an abbreviated business section.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Michael, I